The great danger arising from the existence of people forced to live outside the common world is that they are thrown back in the midst of civilization on their natural givenness, on their mere differentiation. They lack that tremendous equalizing of differences which comes from being citizens of some commonwealth, and yet, since they are no longer allowed to partake in the human artifice, they begin to belong to the human race in much the same way as animals belong to a specific animal species. The paradox involved in the loss of human rights is that such loss coincides with the instant when a person becomes a human being in general, without a profession, without a citizenship, without an opinion, without a deed by which to identify and specify himself. And different in general, representing nothing but his own absolutely unique individuality, which, deprived of expression within and action upon a common world, loses all significance. The danger in the existence of such people is twofold. First, and more obviously, the ever-increasing numbers threaten our political life, our human artifice, the world which is the result of our common and coordinated effort in much the same, perhaps even more terrifying way as the wild elements of nature once threatened the existence of man-made cities and countrysides. Deadly danger to any civilization is no longer likely to come from without. Nature has been mastered, and no barbarians threaten to destroy what they cannot understand, as the Mongolians threatened Europe for centuries. Even the emergence of totalitarian governments is a phenomenon within, not outside our civilization. The danger is that a global, universally interrelated civilization may produce barbarians from its own midst by forcing millions of people into conditions which, despite all appearances, are the conditions of savages. Hannah Arendt. Israel is not a state. Now, we have been hearing a lot about Israel's right to exist, which, as an aside, is not a thing. And before anyone is too shocked when I say that no, Israel does not have the right to exist, no state has a right to exist. This is not an opinion, this is simply a fact. Before anyone wants to disagree here, I challenge you, show me where in international law it says that a state has a right to exist. This is not a thing. And it is a good thing that this is not a thing. For example, I come from Germany, and if there was such a thing as a state's right to exist, then my country, Western Germany, would have violated that right by reuniting with Eastern Germany in 1990, because that would have violated East Germany's right to exist. And likewise, if there was another referendum in Scotland and the Scots decided to leave the UK, then that would violate the UK's right to exist, because then it would no longer be the United Kingdom, it would be the disunited kingdom, right? Or likewise, when the Soviet Union fell apart, when Ukraine and Belarus and the Baltic states and Kazakhstan and so on split off from the Soviet Union, that did not violate the Soviet Union's rights to exist. I mean, maybe Putin thinks so, but otherwise, no, there is no such thing as a state's right to exist. What there is a people's right to self-determination. And that is being violated for decades now. And I see only one people in the Levant whose right to self-determination is being violated for decades. And it is not the Israeli people. It is not the Jewish people. But that aside, we have been hearing about this so-called right of the state of Israel to exist. And there are people disagreeing on this, of course. There are people saying the state of Israel does have a right to exist. and there are people saying the state of Israel does not have a right to exist, and there are people saying the state of Israel should not exist. But no matter where they stand on this, usually they would probably agree that, at least as of now, the state of Israel does exist, no matter whether that is a good thing or a bad thing. Well, I here want to deny not the right of the state of Israel to exist, but I want to deny the fact of it existing. There is no state called Israel. There simply isn't. And this is something that both Israel's apologists and Israel's opponents will probably find to sound quite strange. How could anyone deny that there is an Israel? And I want to clarify right away that I'm of course not denying the existence of Israel. I'm just denying the existence of the state of Israel. So in other words, there is a thing called Israel, but that thing is not a state. Even though it seems to be a state, it is no real state. What is it then? Well, as you can note, if you have been following this channel, I have for way over a year now given a lecture series on Kant. As you can tell, I'm taking a little break from that. Don't worry, I will get back to that. I'm not done. There will be many more lectures on Kant. But we have an upcoming anniversary, a double anniversary even. Because Hannah Arendt, who is one of the most important thinkers of the last century, a political thinker mainly, Hannah Arendt in this year marks the 50th anniversary of her death. And then following that, the next year will be her 120th birthday. On the other hand, we of course also have another anniversary, a much less happy one, and that is the anniversary of 2 years of genocide, 2 years of live-streamed genocide even. The first live-streamed genocide in human history, which makes you all the more guilty if even by this year, even by 25, you are still a denier of genocide. Because, I mean, speaking as a German, our grandparents lied when they said, oh, we didn't know. Of course they knew. Everyone knew. But nowadays, you really cannot get away with saying I didn't know. If you didn't know because you didn't want to know. We have seen 2 years of genocide, and as I'm speaking here, they are telling us that it's over now. I mean, no one can predict. I don't claim that I can predict what's happening next. It would certainly a good thing if there would be a ceasefire for a while, and if some humanitarian aid could get into Gaza. But I assure you, the real issue is not resolved, and the real genocide, or at the very, very least, the risk of genocide is not over, as long as the Palestinians don't have statehood, as long as they remain stateless people. And this is one thing I will explain in this lecture. But anyway, since we have this anniversary of both Hannah Arendt and of both the genocide, this seems to me as good as any a moment to talk a bit about Hannah Arendt and about what we might learn from her as concerning the current situation in the world. I will focus here on Israel, but I will also make some remarks on some other things going on in the world, some other countries. And Hannah Arendt is especially famous, amongst some other things, for her work on totalitarianism. Her book on the origins of totalitarianism is one of her more famous books. And she is one of the first to have studied the new phenomenon of totalitarianism. Her book having come out only a few years after the end of Nazi totalitarianism, and while the Stalinist totalitarianism was still going on. And it is this what I want to focus on here. Because if you read that book, and if you know anything about Israel, then it becomes impossible not to make comparisons. It is just very obvious that a lot of what Arendt says about totalitarianism fits very well with what we can see in Israel. So much so that I'm surprised that I haven't heard anyone else talk about it yet, because I mean, it's not like Arendt isn't known. It's not like I'm the only person who has read her. And I have, for over a year now, I have listened to a lot of talks, interviews about Israel, basically every day. I mean, when I'm cooking, when I'm cleaning, I'm listening to talks, to lectures, to podcasts, basically all the time when I'm not reading or writing myself. And for over a year now, I've listened to mainly talks about Israel by knowledgeable people, by real experts in their fields, and I've learned quite a lot. But this explicit connection with Hannah Arendt that I want to make here is something I've not run across. I mean, maybe it's out there somewhere, but I have not run across it, and that's why I think it's about time someone makes it. That's why I'm sitting down to make it now. I want to make one thing clear now, and that is that I'm not claiming that Israel is totalitarian. The word is thrown around a lot nowadays, but people don't know what it means. People use it either to mean very extreme forms of despotism and tyranny, very extreme forms of oppression. So people might say North Korea is totalitarian or China is totalitarian. Or often people use the word in polemics, right? Just saying that their political enemies are totalitarian. At least here in Germany, that's something they will often do. And then you hear stuff like, oh, the Green Party is totalitarian. They want to tax me for the fuel for my car. That's totalitarian. And I mean, whatever you think about specific parties or policies or activists or whatever, you are maybe welcome to criticize them, but mindlessly using the word totalitarian as an insult is in itself an insult to the victims of real totalitarianism. No. To Hannah Arendt, totalitarianism means something very specific. And she insists that there have been only two totalitarian systems, and that is the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. And even here, she stresses it's only the Soviet Union under Stalin, not before, not after. Of course, before and after, it has also been despotic. It has not been a free state, but it has not been totalitarian. And in the case of the Nazis, she would say it's only Nazi Germany in the second half. So in the 6 years of the Second World War, not in the 6 years before the war. Of course, it was despotic, it was tyrannical in those first 6 years, but it was not totalitarian. And of course, Arendt has been dead for 50 years, but I'm quite sure that had she seen those 50 years till our day, she would still stick to her original judgment. I'm pretty sure she would say that no current country, no, not even North Korea, is totalitarian. There's nothing that completely fits her definition of totalitarianism. And one simple reason why Israel is not totalitarian, not the only one, I could also talk about other things, but one quite obvious reason why it's not totalitarian, and why it also cannot ever be, is how small it is. Because Arendt says totalitarianism needs a huge human material. It needs superfluous human beings that can be sacrificed in the millions. And not even just of your enemies. Of course, Israel lacks those in such quantities. I mean, there simply aren't as many Palestinians. No matter how they kill, they cannot reach Hitler's or Stalin's death toll. But also of your own. Because totalitarianism also makes your own people superfluous, and is also about sacrificing your own in large numbers. And that's something that Israel simply cannot afford. I mean, even now, right? There are about, or at least there were before the 7th of October, about an equal number of Jews and Palestinians between the river and the sea. But the Palestinians get more children. So even now, Israel is struggling, is losing the demographic fight, so to say. So as much as the extremists, the fundamentalists, the right-wingers in Israel might dislike the more secular Jews, the more liberal Zionists, they cannot just afford to sacrifice them in large numbers. They have to work together with them to some degree. So for that reason alone, because it's so small, Israel can never turn into fully developed totalitarianism, no matter what else might happen. But even though that might be the case, still Arendt also says that while only Nazi Germany and Stalinist Soviet Union have been fully totalitarian, elements and aspects of totalitarianism can appear even in not fully totalitarian systems. Even in a democracy, there can be elements of totalitarianism, Arendt says. By which, of course, I don't mean to say that Israel is a democracy, because, well, half the people under Israel's rule cannot vote, right? That's not democratic. And as a small aside here, I'm a philosopher, and people are not aware of that, but philosophers are realists. They are radical realists. They look at things and see them for what they are. And they refuse to be told what a thing is, but rather they look and then they judge. And I mean, this is not just the philosopher doing that. I mean, all my work is about Aufklärung, about aufkläring people, so teaching people to think critically, to think for themselves, to be independent. And this is what the aufklärt person does. The aufklärt person in general, not just a philosopher more specifically, is a radical realist. So most people, they are willing to believe what they are told. You can tell them that a red object is green and they will believe you. They will say, it's green because I was told it is green. You can tell them that when you're holding one apple in your hand, that you're holding two apples, and they will believe you. And if you think what I'm saying here is ridiculous or is too much, no, I mean that. I really mean it. People are willing to believe absolutely everything despite what they see, simply because they are told. They believe what they are told more than their own judgment, because they cannot judge for themselves if they are not aufklärt. And they will believe completely mindlessly. Let me give you examples. What is a doctor? Most people, when they meet someone and that person tells them, I'm a doctor, I hold a PhD, I'm a doctor, or when they are told by a university, right? Here, this guy is a doctor, we made him a doctor, we promoted him to doctor. Most people will now believe that this person is a doctor. He's in fact, in many cases, not. And there are maybe cases where someone doesn't say he's a doctor, or where a university doesn't say that he's a doctor, and he is indeed a doctor. Because what is a doctor? Docere in Latin means to teach, to learn, to give learning to others. So doctus is a person who learned something, a person that got schooled, right? The scholar. And doctor is the teacher of scholarship, is he who gives his scholarship to others. So he is the learned teacher of learning. Well, many people that are usually called doctors haven't really learned anything. They are clueless. And even if they have learned something, many of them don't spend their life spreading that learning. Like any physician, for example, right? It always annoys me when physicians are called doctors, as is usually done in English, and there are other languages where there's not even another word like physician that you might use. They are not, right? Usually, if you work as a physician, treating people, healing people, you might have learned something, but you're not spreading it. You're using it to help people, but you are not teaching it to other people. So you're not a doctor. So I judge for myself who's a doctor. I don't care if somebody tells me, or if some university tells me this guy is a doctor. I look and I ask, does he have knowledge? Is he a scholar? And does he pass on that knowledge? And then he's a doctor. Or second example, who is married? Lots of people will say, well, if two people present themselves as married, if they say we are married, then lots of people will believe it. Or if a state says these two people are married, we married them off, they are now registered as married, most people will just mindlessly believe that these two people are married now, but they are maybe not. This is a registered life partnership, but it's not necessarily a marriage. Again, I, being a realist, not living in the clouds, not just believing that someone is a doctor or someone is married just because everyone says so, I look, and then when I see that two people have a real bond, a real unity, are one heart and one soul, then they are married, whether they have a certificate to show for it or not. But if they are not, if they are two separate people, even though they might be living together or might be having sex or might be having children, then this is not marriage. So what I'm saying here is I look at the world very different from how most people do. Because again, I look at the world, at what it really is, not what I'm told it is. And that is precisely the reason, coming back to Israel, that is precisely the reason why I say there are 7 million people in Israel that cannot vote. Many people would disagree with me. Many people would say, no, that's not the case. They are not in Israel. I mean, the Palestinians in the West Bank or in Gaza, they don't belong to Israel. But they do. This is simply a fact. They are part of Israel. Now, of course, they are not claimed as such. It's claimed that they don't belong to Israel, but they do. They are not citizens, but they are subjects of Israel. I mean, for all the talk about solutions, 2-state solution, 1-state solution, no-state solution, 5-state solution, whatever the solution is, we need to acknowledge the current reality. And currently we have a 1-state reality, which, by the way, is not, I'm not the first one to say that. Others have come up with the term before me. And between the river and the sea, there's one single state that controls everything. And every person that lives between the river and the sea is, even if not a citizen, then a subject of that state, is being controlled by that state and by that state's government. It's not that there is a state on a part of the land between the river and the sea, and then another part of the land has no state at all. But no, all the land between the river and the sea is controlled by that one state. And therefore, since all the people between the river and the sea are completely controlled by and dependent of that one government, but half of them have no part in that government, cannot vote for it, this is clearly not a democracy. But coming back to Arendt and totalitarianism, what I'm saying is, even if it was a democracy, even in that case, there could still be, even if not full-blown totalitarianism, then at least elements of totalitarianism. And that is what I want to talk about here. I don't want to say that Israel is fully totalitarian, but there are clearly elements of totalitarianism. Now, what does totalitarianism mean? Lots of people would think that there are or could be totalitarian states. But what I want to tell you is that no, there is no such thing, and there cannot be such a thing as a totalitarian state. That would be a contradictio in adjecto, meaning a self-contradiction. The adjective totalitarian does not go together with state. If you have a state, then it's not totalitarian. If it is totalitarian, then there cannot be a state. Totalitarianism is not about a state. It's not simply a form of state. It's a movement. Because it's in the very word. What is totalitarianism? It's about total power, total rulership. And if you think about what a state is, then there cannot be total rulership in a state. A state means, by its very nature, by its essence, it means the limitation of rulership. And that is true even for a despotic state. Even for a tyrannical ruler, if he is a mere tyrant and not a totalitarian Führer, he is not omnipotent. He cannot do everything. To be more precise, there are two ways in which the rulership is limited in the state. It is limited inwardly by its laws, by its hierarchies, and so on. And it is limited outwardly by its borders. A state is something steady, something solid. Within the state, within its laws, within its structures, within its institutions, there can be movement. Sure, there can be a social life, there can be a political life of the people in the state, and there can be progress. The society can change, but the state as such does not change. The state provides the fundament for the life of the people and for the movement of the people. Just like in the body. Of course, I can move around with my body, but the basic structure of my body, my skeleton, which holds the thing together, does not change or bend. Or consider a tree. The tree might grow, the tree might grow certain fruits that you can pluck. It might blossom, but the tree needs firm roots in the ground to stand. And everything that happens, the growth of the fruits, happens on top of the fundament that those roots provide. Well, totalitarianism means there is no fundament. There is no solidity, there is no security. The rug is pulled from our feet, so to say, and there's just endless movement, endless accumulation of power that never stops, that is never satisfied. There's never enough power, but the power always needs to grow, needs to become more total. The control always needs to intensify, both inwardly, the control of the subjects, as well as outwardly by expanding the borders. So let's get into that a little more.
Each time I've gone, I think I'm going to be prepared, but each time I'm woefully unprepared, I'm afraid, because the horrors just get worse. This most recent trip I had a month out there. I knew what I was going to see. I knew I was going to see malnutrition. I knew I was going to see relentless mass casualties, but it was just so much worse than I thought. The malnutrition was deeply distressing to witness, watching newborn babies die of malnutrition, watching children die of malnutrition, watching adults who I'd operate on die of malnutrition. Just so much worse than I'd seen even last year when I was there. And the new experience, seeing, which I would never have imagined I would see, the multiple shootings I operated on, saw patients from multiple shootings affecting very young teenage boys, sometimes as young as 11 or 12, who'd all been shot by Israeli soldiers and quadcopters at the food distribution sites, the bizarrely named Gaza Humanitarian Foundation sites. And seeing these young boys being brought in, one of them, a 12-year-old boy, died on the operating table while we were operating on him because his injuries were so severe. But seeing many of these kids being brought in, they were going to these food distribution sites, they were going to get food for their starving families. And the particularly distressing thing was the clustering of particular body part shootings on particular days. So one day, for example, we'd see these young boys coming in with predominantly gunshot wounds to the head, another day gunshot wounds to the neck, another day gunshot wounds to the chest or the abdomen. One day, even 2.5 weeks ago, we saw 4 young teenage boys, all of whom brought in at the same time with gunshot wounds to the testicles. And the clustering, the targeting was so striking that it was inconceivable that it was coincidence. And it just made us all believe this was some sort of obscene target practice, some games being played by the Israeli soldiers. And the narrative, the descriptions I received from the families, from the patients, and indeed from close friends of mine, Gaza and healthcare workers who'd been at the food distribution points, all described the same thing of Israeli soldiers and quadcopters shooting these poor young boys. So just awful, and nothing could have prepared me for that.
Let's start with the inside, so to say. As I already said, in a normal state, you have a certain structure. You have laws, for example. And these laws, they might be unjust laws, they might be bad laws, but they are still laws. And even the government, even the ruler, cannot just break any law. Maybe he can change the law, but as long as the law is as it is, he is somewhat bound by it, probably. And likewise, there are certain hierarchies, like there are people that have certain jobs within the state, right? And the Minister of Agriculture can probably not just do something that belongs to the Minister of Education. Like he cannot just make rules about the education. And there are certain institutions that have certain jobs, certain responsibilities. And all of this limits the power, limits the abilities of rulership in a regular state. Again, even in a tyrannical state. And what you get in totalitarianism is that the state is destroyed. Totalitarianism, as I already said, it's a movement. The Nazis really loved that word. They would talk a lot about the National Socialist movement. That's how they understood themselves. And of course, also the Bolsheviks, the communists, understood communism as a movement. And that movement may come to power in a particular state, like Germany or like Muscovy. It may take control of one particular state at first, but Arendt says it remains a movement. That's the difference even to the fascists like Mussolini in Italy. Arendt says usually when a dictator rises to power, he's content just taking over the state. And his people, like the people from his party, they will then take over the state. They will then become the ministers and the heads of police and military and so on. But the state as such will remain more or less intact. With totalitarian movements, that is different. They may claim the state, but the state is just sort of their base of operation. It's just sort of their starting point. But then, even in power, they undermine and try to destroy the state, to set into motion what otherwise would be solid. Which is why, for example, Timothy Snyder, who's one of the most important living historians, focused on the Second World War and Eastern Europe in the Second World War, likes to say, which to most people would sound strange at first maybe, but likes to say Hitler was an anarchist. And Hitler basically says as much in Mein Kampf, in his famous book. He didn't care about the German state. He says states come and go. There have been other states on German soil before. What he cared about is the race, of course, the Aryan race, which in his mind transcends the state. The state is a means to an end to the totalitarian, but they need to destroy the state. And only this destruction of the state, of its institutions, of its laws, only that makes possible their totalitarian crimes. It is quite striking that, for example, the Nazis, they never officially abolished the Republic, right? So before the Nazis, if you don't know the German history, there was, of course, the Weimar Republic since the end of World War One. I mean, it was not officially called that. It was just called that because it sort of got formed. The constitution got formed in the city of Weimar. Officially, it was still the Deutsche Reich, so the German Empire. That's quite strange. They never changed the name, even though they had no emperor anymore. And the first line of the constitution was, the German Empire is a republic, which of course makes no sense. And this might indicate part of the problem why it failed. Like they never really made a true turn from empire to republic, but that's another story. But the point is, the Nazis rose to power in 1933, being voted in. They were simply the winners of an election. And then they made what is called the Ermächtigungsgesetz. So translated into English, that means the empowerment law. Under the pretense of having to secure Germany, under the pretense of Germany being threatened by communists. I mean, the Reichstag, the parliament building, had just burned down, and the Nazis blamed communists for that. To this day, it's not quite certain who burned it down. It might actually be that it was indeed the communists who set fire to it. It might that the Nazis just took advantage of that. Might also be that they did it themselves, but be that as it may, they passed this empowerment law, which, I mean, to this moment, they were a democratically elected government, and they had a majority that passed that law, so it was a democratic process. And that empowerment law, well, it basically empowered them to pass further laws without the parliament. So the parliament was not needed anymore. And then amongst the first laws they passed was dissolving all political parties except their own. So not only was the parliament not needed anymore, there also weren't any parliamentarians anymore from other parties. And then, of course, they did other things. They abolished the trade unions. They took over the media. They, of course, started making laws against the Jews. But the thing that Arendt points out is they never formally abolished the Republic. The Weimar Constitution always remained in place. There was still a constitution saying we are a republic, saying there are certain human rights and so on. All the Nazis made is they had this empowerment law, this emergency law, and then all the time they sort of made emergency laws, further amendments. But you would think, and I mean, they would have had the power to do that if they wanted, you would think that they would sort of formalize their rulership, that they would pass a new constitution saying Germany is a Führer state, and Germany is ruled by a Führer, and the Führer can do whatever he wants. But no, they didn't do that. They always left the old constitution in place, even though it was basically meaningless, of course. And likewise in the Soviet Union, of course, there was no old constitution. It's not like they kept some Tsarist constitution, but Stalin actually passed his own new constitution, only to then go on to constantly break it and constantly ignore it. And Arendt says that in totalitarianism, you could say in a way, there is no proper legislative. There's just the executive branch of government. There are not really laws passed necessarily, and if they are ignored. She says totalitarian leaders prefer to rule by decree. They prefer to rule by bureaucracy. And in bureaucracy, you never know really what's happening next, and you are pretty much helpless against the decisions of the bureaucrats. And while a law is something that is kind of set in stone, like you can read it, you know what to expect, you know what the state expects of you, you know what happens to you when you don't do it. You can maybe protest the law, or you can maybe go to court and say that this law is unconstitutional. With decrees, there's much more fluidity. Today, they can pass this decree, and one thing can happen, and tomorrow some other decree can be passed. Something else can happen, taking back the former decree. It's much more arbitrary. You never really know what to expect. You never really know what is expected of you, like how should you behave to not get into trouble. And this is how totalitarianism rules. And again, this is what makes possible the crimes of totalitarianism. I mean, a crime like genocide, like the genocide the Nazis committed, it's not so easy to pull off. Because in a usual state, people are protected. If you belong to a state, even if you are a second-class citizen, maybe you can be oppressed, like black people were in the USA. But black people were not genocided in the USA, as much as they were oppressed. So there's clearly a difference. And what Arendt says is that only if you don't belong, if you have no statehood at all, only then anything can be done to you. I mean, think about why the genocide of the European Jews happened. Unfortunately, to quote Snyder again, and by the way, he expanded on a lot of what Arendt said, and I will add to this lecture 2 lectures of his, and I recommend watching those, especially the second one. I think this will help you further understanding what I'm saying here and further understanding the case of Israel. Snyder laments sometimes that nowadays, in general, not just when it comes to the Nazis or to their genocide, nowadays we have a culture of memory or of remembrance, but we don't have history. That is, people remember that something happened, mostly at anniversaries, and then they may talk about it, someone may give a speech and say, oh, this was terrible, it should never happen again, like we remember that there was the Holocaust, or we remember that there was 9/11 or whatever, but we don't really do actual history. I mean, actual historians do. I'm not saying it does not happen, but I'm saying the broader public or what people learn in school, there's no real sense of history, like of understanding, not just out of context happenings that took place, but understanding really what happened and why and how it happened. And this is very much the case with the genocide of the Jews, because usually we get told, oh, it was anti-Semitism. They were killed because of anti-Semitism, which sounds right, but is actually incredibly superficial and infantile an explanation. Because, I mean, of course, it would be absurd to say that anti-Semitism played no part. I mean, surely the anti-Semitism of Hitler and his movement is the reason that the Jews specifically were picked as victims. But still, anti-Semitism as such is not a sufficient explanation for what happened. Because, and I mean especially the apologists of Israel and of Zionism, they keep telling us that anti-Semitism is this eternal thing. There was always anti-Semitism everywhere, which of course is not true. It's very much a European thing. There was no anti-Semitism in the Arab world. But if there was anti-Semitism before the Nazis, then why was there no genocide of Jews before the Nazis? And why did the Nazis themselves, for that matter, why did they not genocide the Jews sooner? I mean, I'm not saying that within the first 6 years of Nazi rule it was fun to be a Jew in Germany. There was apartheid in Germany. We are not used to applying the word here, but the Nuremberg racial laws were, of course, laws of apartheid. Jews were being oppressed, to be sure. But they were not killed. The Nazis murdered less than 200 Jews in the first 6 years of their rule. Now, what's the explanation here? Were the Nazis not so anti-Semitic back then, and then they only became more anti-Semitic in the Second World War? Of course not. The explanation is that something like the genocide of the German Jews, of German citizens, would not have been possible without the war. And also, if you look at where most Jews were killed, they were, of course, mostly killed in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltics, both in absolute and in relative numbers. If you compare, in Western and Central Europe, 1 out of 2 Jews survived. Of course, it's still a terrible death toll, every other Jew being killed. But in that area in Eastern Europe, Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, 1 out of 20 Jews survived, and the other 90 were killed. There's a very, very clear difference here. And what's striking is that this is true even for Germany, right? Even in Germany itself, like half the Jews survived. I mean, wouldn't you think, if you approach this naively, that in Germany itself, the Nazis would have been most thorough, and that there it would have been most easy for them to clear the country of all the Jews because they really had full control? Shouldn't have more or less 100% of German Jews died? But it's not the case. the Nazis, and again, not just in absolute, but also in relative numbers, killed more Jews in Poland or in Ukraine. Why? And again, people try to explain it through anti-Semitism. They will say, well, Eastern Europe was so anti-Semitic, so many people collaborated with the Nazis there. That explanation, apart from being quite superficial, is also quite racist, if you ask me, because, well, we always have this racism against the Slavs, against Eastern Europe. No, they are more racist, they are more backwards, they are more primitive, they are not as enlightened as we. Of course, they were much more anti-Semitic. There's nothing really to support that. It's not like anti-Semitism in Western Europe was not a thing. I mean, the French had their Dreyfus affair, for example. And if you compare in the 20s and the 30s the levels of anti-Semitism, you cannot really say that Eastern Europe was necessarily more anti-Semitic. But even if it had been, I mean, you can even look at specific countries. Let's look at France. Who are the main victims of the genocide of the Jews in France? You would think it's French Jews, right? I mean, who else would mainly have been killed when the Jews in France get killed than French Jews? But you would be wrong. The main victims were Polish Jews. There was quite a large number of Polish Jewish refugees, even from the First World War, living in France. And almost all of them were killed. While of the French Jews, of course, also many French Jews were killed, but still a relatively large number of them survived. So there was a difference. It was harder for the Nazis to deport Jews that had French citizenship, while the Jews, the refugees, the Polish Jews in France that nobody wanted in France, they were easier to deport. I mean, that's the explanation we need to give, right? You cannot explain this fact by the fact that maybe Poland was more anti-Semitic than France. Even if that might be true, that would not explain why many Polish Jews were killed not just in Poland itself, but also in France. No, the explanation is that they did not have the protection of a state. As long as you have some sort of citizenship, it is much, much harder to deport you, to murder you, than when you have none. And the thing about Eastern Europe, this area of Ukraine, Belarus, that Timothy Snyder calls the Bloodlands, that's also the title of one of his books, and that's what the lecture is about that I'm linking here. The special thing about this area is that statehood was destroyed completely here. In Western Europe, in France, and in Denmark, and Norway, Nazis might have conquered the state and occupied the state, but they more or less left the state intact, somewhat accepted the existing institutions and administration. But in Eastern Europe, they completely destroyed the state. And this area, these Bloodlands, that's the area where the state was destroyed twice, where both totalitarian systems, the Soviet Union and the Nazi regime, took over for a while and both completely destroyed the state, where we had a complete breakdown of the state. And this was the job of the SS. I mean, the SS, they were not a police force, they were not a military force. They guarded the concentration camps. And the concentration camp is basically a stateless, a lawless zone. Even if it is on the territory of a state, then it's like an island of statelessness within the state. If you are in the concentration camp as an inmate, you stop being a human being in legal terms. You might as well be an animal that could just be slaughtered without repercussions. There are no laws, not even the most unjust, the most discriminatory laws in a concentration camp. You are under the complete power and the complete arbitrary rule of your guards, of the camp leader. And when statehood was destroyed in Eastern Europe, which was the job of the SS, they learned in the concentration camps, and they were state destroyers. They sort of followed the armies. They went into the territories already conquered by the armies and already pacified. That's one thing that Arendt points out. They didn't fight partisans. They didn't fight insurgencies. They went into areas the Nazis already controlled, and that's where they committed their crimes. That's where they committed genocide. And you could say that in a way, all of Eastern Europe was turned into one giant open-air concentration camp. And this is what's required for totalitarianism, right? Philosophical tradition since Hobbes has distinguished the state of nature and having a state, having a social contract and living in a state with laws. And in the state of nature, when there are no laws, Hobbes says, well, the man is man's wolf. And in the state of nature, there's a war of all against all. And basically, it's might makes right, right? Well, totalitarianism is sort of the return to this state of nature. This is why Snyder calls Hitler an anarchist. The state is abolished, the state is destroyed, and all laws are abolished, all rules are abolished. And you go back to the state of nature, but it's not one man against one man, but rather it's one movement, one mass movement against one singular man. So it's the state might makes right, and no one is more mighty now than this totalitarian movement. And they can do everything now. So the important point is, again, if you have no citizenship, you have no rights at all. Arendt would say that the biggest political issue of the 20th century is maybe the refugee problem. Many people think this is a new thing. Especially here in Europe, we think that somehow since 2015 we are dealing with a refugee crisis. But Arendt says that since the 20th century, every big political event, like the 2 world wars, but also like the war in Vietnam with the boat people, created masses of refugees, of people who don't belong, of people who are superfluous, of people who are basically stateless, who have no citizenship, maybe because their state was actually destroyed, or they have no state, or maybe because formally they do have a state. I mean, the former would be the case, for example, of Palestinians, right? That they have no state. Others, like, let's say, refugees from Syria, formally they might have a state, but their state has basically broken down and cannot take responsibility for them anymore. So, and Arendt points out that even when a political event is meant to solve a refugee problem, it has created a new refugee problem. And here she gives the example of Israel, right, which was meant to take in Jewish refugees. But its creation, of course, brought about the Nakba and made more than 700,000 Palestinians refugees. And of course, Gaza is nothing but a giant refugee camp, and over 70% of people there are the descendants of refugees that were pushed into Gaza. And what Arendt says is that the most important human right, or even the only human right really, is the right to citizenship, because it is the right to have rights at all. Because if you think about the human rights, where do they come from? When did they start being a thing? Well, they were first proclaimed in the American and French revolutions, right? And they are called human rights, but in fact they are more like the citizens' rights. They are the citizens' rights against the state. Because, I mean, usually, what is the state for? The state is there so that citizens have rights against one another, right? And the state is there to keep those rights. So I have the right not to be murdered by my neighbor, not to be robbed by my neighbor. When I make a contract with my neighbor, I have a right to whatever he promised me for my money. And if my neighbor somehow harms my rights, then I can complain to the state, I can take him to court, and the state helps me with that. But the issue is, the state protects me from my neighbor, but who protects me from the state, right? What if the state itself somehow attacks my rights? Well, that's where the human rights come into play, right? The French and the American revolutionaries basically said the ruler is not allowed to just do anything he wants. We, the people, have certain inalienable rights as human beings, and the state must respect those rights of life, of liberty, of property, of free speech, and so on. And if he doesn't, like if the monarch doesn't respect those rights, then he is a tyrant, and that precisely gives us the right to rebel against him, right? That's basically the argument. That's basically how they justified their revolutions. And Arendt points out that this is what human rights were meant to do, to protect us from the state, to protest on the basis of being human, of having these rights, against the state's rulership going too far. And that is why, if you are a citizen of the state, even if you are being oppressed, even if you are a second-class citizen, you can protest, and you can fall back onto your human rights and use them to argue and to demand those rights from the state, right? That's what the women did, for example, right? They said, we are also part of the state, we are also human beings, so we want to have the right to vote. Yeah, or that's what the black people did, that's what Martin Luther King did, saying we too are humans, we too are part of the state, and so we too have rights. And you can say that in general, more or less every oppressed group, I mean, I'm not saying that things are solved and everything is great now, but you cannot deny that there has been improvements for women, for black people, for gay people. Oppressed groups actually did manage to fight for equal rights, more or less everywhere, when they were part of the state. The problem is, if you aren't part of the state, then you cannot really protest for your rights, right? It's called human rights, but Arendt says, ironically, if you are nothing but human, if you are not a citizen but only a human, you don't really have human rights. you cannot protest as a foreigner, as an immigrant, as a refugee against being deported or whatever. The protest too can be shut down and you can be deported all the sooner. And I mean, the state might even agree with you on paper. They might even say, yes, you're right, you do have human rights. Yes, foreigner living amongst us, you are right that everyone should have the right to vote, that it's undemocratic if some people are not allowed to vote. But you are not a citizen. We are not responsible for you. You should have the right to vote, just not here. You should vote somewhere else in your state. But what if your state doesn't feel responsible for you either? What if you don't have a state? What if your state broke down? Then you have rights nowhere. And that is precisely why Arendt, again, where she says the real human right is citizenship, because it is the right to even have rights. If you are a citizen, even if all your other rights are taken away from you, you can protest against that and you can fight for your rights. But if you are not even a citizen, if you don't belong to that particular state, if the state does not feel responsible for you in any way, anything can happen to you. And I mean, think about it. Think about genocides. And now I'm not talking about the genocide the Nazis committed anymore. Think about other genocides. They usually happen not in a functioning state. They don't happen in times of so-called peace. No matter how racist the society might be, no matter how unjust and oppressive the state might be, there isn't genocide being committed. At least not, for lack of a better term, a loud genocide. Maybe there's more quiet, more slow, more creeping genocides, like happened in the USA, in Canada, in Australia, like is happening now in China with the Tibetans and the Uyghurs, like genocides where children are being taken away and re-educated in the other culture to oppress their culture, or maybe genocides where people are sterilized. But this, let's say, loud genocide, it can only really happen in war times, right? Think about the genocides that we witnessed in our days. I mean, there's currently a genocide in Sudan and a genocide in Myanmar. And what do both of those have in common? Well, both of those are civil war situations where the state has broken down. Or think of Daesh, what is usually called ISIS. You had the US destroying the Iraqi state. I mean, to be sure, unlike the Nazis with the Polish state or with Ukraine, they didn't mean to destroy the state. They meant to change the state, change the system, change the government. But de facto, they destroyed the state. They made the state so weak that it couldn't really control the territory anymore. And that is where Daesh could rise. And in the neighboring country, of course, in Syria, you again had a civil war. So there also, the state was basically destroyed. And here Daesh, which I would characterize as a totalitarian movement, I mean, they didn't have the time to really establish themselves, to spread further, to accumulate more power. But there's a lot about them which fits with how Arendt describes totalitarianism. Here they could strive in this stateless territory of Iraq and of Syria. And here they could commit genocide against the Yazidi people. And generally, those who want to commit such crimes, they are aware of that. I mean, here in Germany, we have this Nazi party, the AfD, which was founded 12 years ago, and then in 2017 they were voted into the parliament, and they've been steadily on the rise, and now they are the strongest party. And last year it came out through investigative journalists that they had held a secret meeting. Several AfD politicians and also some other people, other well-known right-wingers, far-right people, also some so-called conservatives, because of course they will always partner up with the far-right. And they held this private conference where they, amongst themselves, openly talked about and planned how to get rid of all the foreigners in Germany. And they planned that if they rose to power, they want to basically deport all the refugees. And that's the easy part, right? Because refugees, they basically have no rights. You can just deport them, you can just push them away. I mean, the EU at its borders is already, it's murdering all the refugees, drowning them in the Mediterranean, right? It's paying North African despots, it's paying Libya, Algeria, Tunisia to push refugees back into the desert where they die. That's easy. But these Nazis would also like to get rid of the, let's say, more established foreigners, of those who have foreign roots, like the people with Turkish roots who have German citizenship, who maybe are born here, maybe even their parents were already born here. And that's harder. And in that conference, they talked about how they can basically bully them to leave the country more or less voluntarily. So how can they make life in Germany hard for them so that they would eventually immigrate? So they were aware that these people who have German citizenship cannot just be deported so easily. They are aware that even if they are in power, even if they hold a majority, still they cannot just completely break the law, completely break the constitution so easily. I mean, in fact, in the German constitution, it also says that you cannot take away citizenship from anyone who doesn't have another state's citizenship. And this is, of course, a lesson we learned from the Nazis, because the Nazis did that. They eventually passed a law that a German Jew, if he leaves Germany, automatically loses citizenship. And of course, the law did not specify that he had to leave Germany voluntarily. So, of course, when Jews were deported, the moment the trains passed the German border, they stopped being German citizens. And now the constitution makes sure this cannot be done anymore so easily. And yeah, the Nazis are aware that this is a problem for them, that this is where they cannot just deport people. But with all of what I said in mind, you can now better understand certain things happening in the world, right? You can understand the genocide in Ukraine. And yes, this is also a genocide. Most people are not aware. It's usually not discussed as a genocide, but of course it's a genocide. Putin states it very openly that he wants to not just conquer some territory, he wants to eradicate the Ukrainian people as such. Maybe not kill them all, kill as many as necessary, but this is also, of course, a problem when it comes to the Gaza genocide, that many people just don't understand that genocide does not necessarily mean killing everyone or putting everyone in gas chambers. It means destroying a people as such, and that's what he wants to do. He wants to destroy Ukrainian identity, culture, language. He's abducting Ukrainian children to be raised by Moscovian parents, And he's denying the very existence of Ukraine. He's saying it's a fake nation, right? Which incidentally is also what the Zionists do, denying the existence of Palestinians, saying they are just Arabs, there's no Palestinian identity. This is what often happens in genocide. Well, this genocide in Ukraine, it happens in the context of a war and in the context of, in eastern Ukraine, in the territories conquered by Muscovy, the state being destroyed. You can also see these totalitarian elements in the US with all the deportations of refugees. Sometimes even people that have been living in the US for 20 years, just never acquired the citizenship, but been fully integrated, living normal lives. You can see that they are easy to deport, right? The people with citizenship, even if they are black or Latino or whatever, they are harder to get. Not that these people wouldn't like to also get rid of them, but that's harder. But the refugees, they're easy to deport, right? Other immigrants, I mean, even tourists have been in some instances, right? This was in the news here that some German tourists had been apprehended. And this is this typical totalitarian arbitrariness. But you see that, for example, students who are not even there as illegal immigrants, but totally legally, people who have a green card, like think of someone like Mahmoud Khalil with a green card, married to an American citizen that is pregnant by him. Still, students, because they protested for Palestine, maybe, were taken away in bright daylight by people hiding their faces. This is, even though of course the US is not fully totalitarian, but this is a typical element of totalitarianism. And what Arendt, also others like Snyder, say here is of course very interesting in light of the current, all around the Western world, the current rise of the right, because this right is talking a lot about freedom and liberty, right? They are libertarians, or in league with the libertarians, right? With all these tech fascists like Musk and Thiel and so on. And they are talking a lot about freedom, and they are destroying, of course, wherever they rise to power, they are destroying the state. Bragging about it, how they put the chainsaw to the state, right? It's of course the most prominent case is the US right now under Trump, and till they fell apart also under Musk. But you also have it in Argentina, right, under Milei. When they rise to power, and this is their promise, they are not hiding this, they destroy the state in the name of making it more efficient and in the name of making it more free. But again, Hitler was an anarchist. Hitler also destroyed the state. And this, I think, is a very, very important lesson that and it is unfortunately something that most people are not aware of. I mean, think of this stupid political compass that the internet likes, that you can find on Reddit and so on, right? This political compass where you have these two axes, you have left and right, of course, but then you have authoritarian and you have libertarian, right? And so it is presented as if people could be for more statehood or for less statehood, for more liberty. And then in that compass, of course, Hitler and Stalin, they would be on different sides on the right and left axis, but they would both be on the top of the authoritarian and liberty axis, right? And this is how most people view politics, more or less. They think that you can be either for a strong state or a weak state, and then they think the extremes would be, if you want a very weak state, you want no state at all, you want complete freedom, you want anarchy, you are a libertarian, right? And if you want a very strong state, then you want totalitarianism. You want the state to control everything. But this is completely wrong. I'm not saying that more state is automatically better in every possible way. I'm not saying that the state cannot turn authoritarian. But again, there's a difference, Arendt says, between regular authoritarianism, regular despotism, and totalitarianism. And it's not just a difference of quantity. It's not just totalitarianism being even more authoritarian, being the most oppressive system, being the system with the strongest state. No, it's a difference of quality. And as counterintuitive as it may seem to people at first, totalitarianism is not about a strong state, it's about a weak state, or rather about no state at all. And that's what should make us so wary of guys like Musk or Thiel or of Trump, who, by the way, also presides over a movement, right? Which also is typically totalitarian. Like, he does not have a regular party. Like, his movement took over the Republican Party, but it didn't really grow out of that party. No, it's a movement, this MAGA movement, and the movement is now taking over the state and trying to abolish the state. And yeah, this might seem like it creates more freedom, and they might say that that's what they want freedom. But yeah, it also creates freedom for them to do whatever they want, unrestricted by any laws, by any institutions. And it also creates freedom for the victims, that is, freedom from protection, freedom from belonging, freedom from being citizens of a state where they have the ability, if the state is unjust in some way, to complain, to go to court, to protest, to change the state and its laws. What these people want to do is they want to go back to the state of nature where everything is possible, where it's a war of all against all, and the strongest, and that's necessarily gonna be not the singular person, that person is gonna be helpless, but rather that's necessarily gonna be the movement, right? The mass movement. That's necessarily the guy who has that movement at his back. The strongest can do whatever they want. And you can also see, I said in totalitarianism, you don't really have laws. And that's what you see in the US, that the Republicans in power, they don't pass so many laws, right? I mean, let's put aside what laws are good or bad, how you feel about specific laws, but the simple fact of the matter is that Trump is doing less legislation than Democratic presidents. What Trump is doing or trying to do is mainly to rule by decree, right? So again, you could say it's the executive branch without any legislative branch. Not just like in a normal dictatorship where you have no independent judiciary. You also have no lawmaking in totalitarianism. Not even bad or unjust lawmaking. You just have pure executive power. You just have decrees. You just have, well, so to say, Wild West. And in the Wild West, anything can happen. And in the Wild West, in a lawless area, the Native Americans can just be slaughtered by a stronger force. That's all you need. If you are in a Wild West, not in a state, you just need the strongest force. You just need the totalitarian mass movement. Now, with all of this in mind, let's look at Israel. Let's apply it to Israel. This should not be hard to do. You can very clearly see that this is an exemplary example of totalitarianism. The Palestinians are, in fact, stateless people. They have no citizenship. And with that, they have absolutely no rights at all. They don't even have the right to have rights, right? They are not second-class citizens. I mean, maybe the Israeli Palestinians are, but the ones in the West Bank, the ones in Gaza, there's nothing they can do. They cannot even protest for their rights, right? I mean, sometimes you hear people, if they wanted to resist, why did they have to do it as violently as on October the 7th? Couldn't they just protest peacefully? Well, they did. They did some years ago. There was the Great March of Return, where they peacefully protested in front of the fence surrounding Gaza. They were shot. Israeli soldiers turned it into a sport, into a game, making it a competition. How many Palestinians can you shoot, or picking certain body parts. One day trying to shoot kneecaps, one day trying to shoot heads, one day trying to shoot genitals. That's what peaceful protest got them, and the Western media did hardly even report on it, which is why most people have never heard of the Great March of Return. No, the Palestinians have absolutely no rights at all. They are basically not human beings. I mean, of course, they are human beings, and that's why this is so terrible. But I'm speaking from the perspective, from a legal perspective. Legally, the totalitarian world, the stateless world, the world that has returned to the state of nature, is basically a jungle. And people are treated as savages. So, as beasts, as wild animals. Just like you can go into the jungle and slaughter wild animals, you could go into the Wild West and slaughter Native Americans. And just like that, you can go into the West Bank and slaughter Palestinians. I mean, nothing's gonna happen to you, right? The Israeli settlers, they are regular pogroms, they are regular murders, and nothing happens to the settlers. And in the West Bank, this is a typical totalitarian situation. Like the everyday experience for a Palestinian citizen is a totalitarian experience. You have no rights, no way of protesting, no court to turn to, and everything that happens is completely arbitrary, right? One day there might be a checkpoint here, the next day there might be a new checkpoint there. One day they might just take you away just because, right? Maybe some soldier saw you walk funny and that's suspicious, and so you're taken away. Maybe they break into your home at 3 in the morning and just take you away, right? Or maybe they use your home, right? There's this straw widow tactic where they break into Palestinian homes in the West Bank. They first check with their intelligence service. They first check that the people there are completely innocent, not connected to any resistance or anything, and then they break into their home and they lock the family into a room in their own home, and if someone has to go to the toilet or needs to eat or to take medicine or wants to pray, then tough luck. And I mean, sometimes the soldiers might just use the home, right? Like maybe there's a football World Cup, then they might just sit down in front of the family's TV while the family is locked away and just watch football. But what they also do, what this tactic is about, is they pick a home that is on a hill or somewhere, and then they will pick a window, and the sniper will sit behind the window and just use it to shoot at people that are suspicious down in the city or somewhere. And these things, they are possible in this situation where there is no state, right? In the West Bank, there is no state. It's not like there is the Israeli state, like Israel has officially annexed it, and now there are laws, maybe apartheid laws, but there are laws. But no, the control is completely arbitrary. Like a soldier at a checkpoint can just make up rules on the spot, right? And the people in charge, like military commanders, they don't rule by laws. They pass a new law where Palestinians at least know what they are dealing with, but rather they are ruling by decrees. They are just giving out military orders one day that this is gonna happen. This house is gonna be demolished and Palestinians are gonna be driven away, and that's what's gonna happen. From everything I explained, you can hopefully see how the ongoing genocide denial, from the perspective of someone who knows anything about genocide and about totalitarianism and about the mechanisms of it, is not just wrong, and it's not even just vile and evil. It's also simply ridiculous and betraying ignorance. This is, I mean, there's a reason the Jewish Israeli genocide scholar called it a textbook example of genocide. I could not think of a people on Earth currently that are, so to say, more likely to be victims of genocide than the Palestinians, who have not had citizenship for decades and who have already lived in a more or less totalitarian system. And that is also why I say, even if the slaughter and the starvation should be stopped for now, which of course we should all hope, but even with that, we cannot rest. There will be no true end as long as Palestinians don't get their right to self-determination, as long as they don't become citizens, whether of one common Palestinian state, whether in a two-state solution. That's a discussion for another matter. Although I think it's quite obvious what is more realistic, what is more just, what would be a better solution. But that aside, what should be clear is that they should have citizenship in some state. No matter what state it is, no matter what it's called. But without that, the genocide will not truly end. Or at least the genocide will already be at risk of resuming. It will almost be certain that it resumes, as long as this is not solved. And I will just add that this is philosophical. As you can learn from Fichte, there are basically two ways of cognition, which he calls historic and genetic. Historic cognition, it's not limited to what we call history, but rather it means that you look at what is there, you find the phenomena in the world empirically, and you take note of it being there. Maybe you try to understand what it is you're seeing, but you cannot say why it is there, really. You cannot really say that it must be there. While the genetical cognition means, and that is what the philosopher does, but also the scientist more broadly. That's how Fichte defines science. Genetical cognition. It means that you understand the genesis. That is the coming into being of something. You understand a law, and from that law, the specific singular case must follow with necessity. So, let's say you have a fruit from a tree. Regular people who go by historical cognition, they might fight over what sort of fruit it is. Right? One person might say, well, that's an apple, clearly, looks like an apple, tastes like an apple. And the other person might say, no, it's kind of weirdly shaped, not like a regular apple. Are you sure this is an apple? I don't think that's an apple. And that's how the Gaza genocide has been discussed, right? On the one side, we have many people who say, well, this looks like a genocide. And on the other side, we have people who, surely very unconvincingly, with some sophistry, with some number juggling, say, no, this does not look like a genocide to us. The scientist, the philosopher, does not even need to look at the individual case. I don't need to observe, if I know the laws of gravity, whether something will fall down. I know beforehand, I can predict a priori that if I let go of it, it must fall down. So let's say I know that this is an apple tree. I know that an apple seed was planted here and the tree grew out of an apple seed. Then by the laws of nature, I can predict that the fruits growing there will be apples. Maybe they are weirdly shaped apples. Maybe they don't quite taste like other apples. Maybe there's a reason for that. But still, no matter what they look or taste like, surely they must be apples since they come from this apple seed. And likewise, if you understand certain laws of society, of politics, if you understand the mechanisms of totalitarianism and genocide, then you didn't even have to look at Gaza all that much. You could predict a priori that if there's a spark in the powder keg, it's gonna explode. So you could predict, even before October the 7th, that probably if something like October the 7th were to happen, the response would end up being a genocide.
הספר אלון ולבנון, אלון ולבנון. אלון גר בשמחה ובכיף, במשגב עם, משפחה אוהבת, חברים לשחק איתם, וגן שעשועים נפלא היו לו שם. אך מכל הדברים במשגב העם, אלון אהב את הנוף ההררי הנשקף מביתו. בכל יום הגיף אלון את התריסים להסתכל על הערים, אותם הוא אהב מאוד. בוקר אחד, בדרכו לגן, הצביע אלון על הערים ושאל את אבא, מה הערים האלו? אלו הרי לבנון, ענה אבא. הם יפים, יפים מאוד. אני אוהב את הרי הלבנון, אמר אלון. נכון, הם יפים, אישר אבא. אני רוצה לטייל שם, אמר אלון. אי אפשר, זה מסוכן, האויב נמצא שם. זה עדיין לא שלנו, אמר אבא. זה יהיה שלנו, חשב אלון. לבנון שלנו.
Now, I said totalitarianism hinges on the abolition of the state, because the state limits the power, and the power inwardly, the power, the control over the subjects needs to be limitless, needs to be, well, total. But also, the state also limits the power outwardly, because, well, the state has borders. And no matter how much power some despot may have inside his state, you just have to step over an invisible red line, and all his power goes poof and is gone. Even if you are in North Korea, sure, it's hard to get out, but if you get out, you're out. His power is gone. Not so in totalitarianism. If the rulership is to be total, it cannot accept borders, because that would mean that the rulership is totalitarian inside, but then on the outside, it would have to resign itself to being limited in some way, to accepting other powers, that is, other states, alongside. And it would have to enter some sort of relationship with that other states, right? Maybe some sort of diplomacy, some sort of contracts, some sort of organizations that states enter, like the UN or the EU or whatever. This cannot be in totalitarianism. So Arendt says totalitarian systems don't accept borders. They at least strive for world domination. This does not mean that necessarily they must fight war at any given moment. Maybe they can rest for some years, maybe they can collect their power for some years, and not necessarily will they be constantly engaged in a world war. But they will more or less constantly try to expand, right? Like Hitler expanded, taking in Austria. He took in parts of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland. And then he wanted to expand into Poland. And he didn't even intend to start a world war. I mean, he had this pact with Stalin, right, that both gets a half of Poland. And that was it for now. He thought that he would get away with it, that again the British and the French would not do anything against it. I mean, in the long run, sure, he wanted to go further, but at least at that specific point, he in fact did not plan on a confrontation with France or Britain. Likewise, I mean, the thing is just the totalitarian system, it will not just from day one declare world war on everyone and try to conquer everything, but it will take every chance to expand, right? Likewise, Stalin surely had not specifically planned from the start to conquer all of Eastern Europe, but in fighting back the Nazis, surely he was not going to give up those territories. So the totalitarian system will either incorporate such territories directly, or as the Soviet Union did, and as the Nazis also did for a time, create satellite states that are under its control. So usually, to Arendt, politics is about the plurality of men. And between states, that of course means that there's a plurality of nations, a plurality of states, a plurality of peoples that can sort of respect one another and sort of get into some sort of diplomatic relationship. Totalitarianism wants to destroy the plurality of men and therefore does not accept that there's a plurality of states. To the totalitarian, his own state does not have real borders. There's maybe a point up to which his power reaches, and beyond that, his power has not reached yet, but that's not a real border. That's just let's say, a frontier, right? A temporary frontier. And the drive is always to expand the frontier further. So the totalitarian state is also no state for that reason. Not just is it not a state on the inside, because the laws, the institutions, everything is destroyed. There's just the raw total power. It's also not a state on the outside, because the borders are also destroyed. And therefore all statehood is destroyed, right? This state, like Germany or the Soviet Union, is destroyed. But other states, non-totalitarian states, they are also not accepted as states. This turning back to the state of nature is applied to the whole world. The whole world is treated like the Wild West, like some jungle. Arendt says that other states aren't really treated as other states, not even as enemy states that are to be conquered, but rather as unruly provinces that need to be brought back under one's rule. And this is also something, this need for expansion and this not meeting other states on eye level, not accepting them as proper states, this too is something which we can see in our modern world, right? So again, think of Muscovy, which, I mean, Putin, very much like Hitler, has constantly expanded. Like Hitler, it's not that he ever specifically started a world war, that he ever had a plan to, in one swoop, conquer everything. But throughout his whole career as the president of Muscovy, every few years, he has gone on to conquer something, right? Be it some territories from Georgia, be it the Crimea from Ukraine, be it a bigger chunk of Ukraine. And I mean, like Hitler, when he started the full invasion of Ukraine, he did not expect, I mean, he expected to get away with it again, like he got away 8 years earlier with just grabbing Crimea, right? He did not expect Western powers to stand firmly against him. And I mean, we can hardly call it firmly, but even if they had stood firmly against him, then Ukraine would already have won. But even this little opposition is not what he expected. But if you can see the general drive of Moscovian politics under Putin, it's definitely the drive to constantly expand, which is why it's so naive that some people say, they should just make peace by Ukraine giving its eastern territories to Putin. I mean, apart from the fact that, no, why should they? Why should they just accept being stolen from? But it's clear that that would not even create peace. It's clear that within some years, Putin would attack the west of Ukraine, or would attack the Baltics, or would attack Moldova, or whatever. You can also see this tendency in the US. I mean, maybe here there was always the danger to fall back into that. I mean, the whole history of the US is built on that, right? The original 13 colonies expanded quite a bit, and of course never accepted the other nations, never accepted Native Americans as proper other nations that whose territories you respect, but treated it as, well, literally the Wild West, right, where you can just expand and expand and expand. But now you can see that this is coming back with Trump wanting to annex Canada, wanting to annex Greenland, threatening to go into Mexico to fight drug cartels. And I mean, it's obvious that if that were to happen, he would stay there. He would take a chunk out of Mexico. Or now wanting to basically become the governor of Gaza, right? And the point here is not that he's gonna do all of that. I mean, here in Europe, there's been quite a lot of shock about the Greenland thing, but I think on some level it was clearly overblown, because this is just Trump likes to talk big, that's his style, and then nothing happens. And he just needs to act like a strong man. It's a show for his MAGA base, right? And also, this is his way of making deals. He goes in with the strongest possible demand, basically threatening the other side, in the hopes that for that reason, to not get the worst outcome, the other side will agree to an outcome that is still bad for them. So I don't assume that Trump is gonna annex Canada or attack Greenland soon. But the point is that he talked about it. And he got away with talking about it, right? So it's getting normalized in the US. Clearly, his own bases did not say, this is a step too far, we don't want that, leave Canada or leave Greenland alone. And it's quite striking that he is normalizing not really accepting your neighbors as real countries, as sovereign states who have a right to their sovereignty. And it's quite striking also because these are allies. These have, right, it's not like with Moscow and Ukraine, but rather these have been allies for decades, very reliable allies. So not even one's allies are accepted anymore. And the scary thing, once again, is not that Trump is about to do something, but that this is getting normalized. And I mean, Trump is not going to last forever. He's old. We can hope that he drops dead soon. But the question is what comes after, right? All the people who supported him are not just gonna vanish. And if this movement becomes even more extreme, then it's quite possible that in some years, maybe in 10 years and 20 years, what for him has just been empty talk, for another leader following him will be more than empty talk. And this, again, this constant expansion is something that we, again, see in Israel, right? So this is also why Israel is not a real state. A real state has borders. Where, I ask you, are the borders of Israel? Nobody knows. Nobody can tell us. And everyone has a different opinion about what the borders are. Like everyone who accepts Israel as a state accepts a different Israel within different borders. Like different allies of Israel still have different opinions, a different imagination of what Israel is and where it ends, right? Like there's a lot of talk about a partition plan. When Israel was founded in 48, people will say Israel has a right to exist because the UN said so. But the thing is, Israel does not exist within the borders that were given to it, right? Pretty much right from the start, it started expanding and conquered much more territory. Originally, about 56% of the territory of Palestine were given to Israel. And now they have conquered, so in the first war already, they conquered about 4/5 of the land, leaving only 22% to the Palestinians. And I always find it striking when people talk about the two-state solution, that they just they just assume that the two states are gonna be within the 67 borders. Why? This is not territory that the UN has given to Israel. This is conquered territory. Why should the Palestinians have to accept that? But everyone thinks that, oh, this is just how it's gonna be, right? The Palestinians get 22% of the land. And then, of course, there's the matter of Jerusalem, where also lots of people accept that West Jerusalem has been conquered and is now part of Israel. But also then there are those, like the US under Trump, that accept the annexation of all of Jerusalem. And I mean, de facto, all of Israel's allies accept it, right? Like here in Germany, we have not moved our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem like Trump has. And if you ask German politicians, they will say, no, Jerusalem belongs to the Palestinians. But this is empty talk to just pretend that on some level they care about international law, which of course they don't. But de facto, Germany has fully accepted Israel annexing East Jerusalem. I mean, you cannot... I mean, this goes back to what I said earlier, right? As a philosopher, I don't believe what people tell me. I believe what is real and what I can see to be real. So you cannot just tell me to be against something and then continue to support it. Then, no, you are not against it. I mean, if we were really against Israel annexing East Jerusalem, then we would have sanctioned Israel. Then we would have broken all diplomatic ties with Israel. Then we would have stopped any sort of economic connection with Israel. Then we would have declared war on Israel. But no such thing ever happened. So clearly, Germany, whatever it says, is okay with Israel doing that, right? Like, if your wife cheats on you, and you have a problem with that, then maybe you're gonna divorce her if you find out she cheated. But if you're not divorcing her and she keeps cheating on you, basically in front of your eyes, like not hiding it, you know that she does it, then you can, if you want to, you can tell her 1,000 times that you don't like this, but clearly you are okay with it because you are accepting it. This is just the reality. So, yeah, Israel has annexed, like officially annexed all of Jerusalem, and everyone is okay with it, de facto. But of course it doesn't end there. Israel has annexed all of Palestine. Again, there's a one-state reality, and again, I refuse to be told something. I just look, like, people will say, no, Israel has not annexed Gaza, Israel has not annexed the West Bank, it's just occupying. This is just a lie. It is clearly an annexation. I mean, this so-called occupation is not a temporary occupation. The Allies after World War II, they occupied Germany for 4 years. Just 4 years. After a World War. After all the crimes Germany did. And then a German state was founded. This is not an occupation. This is not temporary. Israel has full control for decades now over the West Bank. And there's zero intention of giving it up ever again. And I would ask anyone who wants to deny that the West Bank is part of Israel, maybe not de jure, but de facto, I would ask any such person, what would have to happen? Like, what fact in the world would need to change for you starting to agree that yes, Israel has annexed this territory? And if your answer is gonna be, well, Israel would have to come out and officially say we are annexing this territory, then I cannot take you seriously. Words are just words. They don't change a thing. Like, if all it needs for you to accept that yes, this territory is annexed is a stamp somewhere, a stamp does not create a reality. A stamp just acknowledges a reality. I mean, are you gonna tell me that if a person is born and gets no birth certificate, maybe grows to be 60, which is more or less the time of this occupation, right? And all this time he's not given a birth certificate. Are you gonna tell me he's not born? He's not alive? He's still in his mother's womb? Or the other way around, if someone dies and there's no death certificate, which happens, right? Like people go missing, so they might be dead, but the state is not aware that they are dead. In the eyes of the state, they are maybe still alive somewhere, so there's no death certificate. Does that mean that they are not really dead? The certificate does not make it so that someone is born or that someone dies. It just acknowledges the fact. And likewise, de facto, Israel has annexed the West Bank, which is precisely why we can talk about apartheid, right? Because all it would be missing to be officially apartheid would be Israel saying, well, this is now ours. So all these Palestinians, which are subject of ours, like in the literal sense, they are subject to our rule. They are now part of our state, but still, they are just subjects, no citizens. They still don't get the right to vote. This is apartheid, right? And if it would be apartheid then it is apartheid now. Because, I mean, how can you disagree with that? If you really disagree with that, then you are saying that, oh, South Africa could just have said, all the black people, yeah, they are not citizens anymore. They are not South Africans anymore. From now on, they are just people that happen to live here. And we are just now occupiers of this territory. It's not really our territory. We are just occupying it. And then it would have been okay. Then it would no longer have been apartheid. This is ridiculous. So let's not deal with this ridiculous opinion. Again, as a philosopher, I stick to reality. I radically refuse to accept anything but the real reality that I see with my eyes. Reality is, this is Israeli territory. Israelis are moving there. Over 700,000 Israelis have moved there, right? And not just, as it's often made out to be, not just a few fringe extremists, some fundamentalist settlers. Sure, they are leading the movement, but there are lots of regular people living there, right? Not even for ideological reasons, maybe just because they like it there, maybe just because it's cheap, right? Rents in Tel Aviv are getting more expensive, so you might just move to the West Bank and live there cheaply, and then you can commute in half an hour to Tel Aviv. And this is, of course, a war crime, right? Under the Geneva Convention. You are not allowed, because that's precisely the difference between occupation and annexation and genocide. You're not allowed to transfer your civilian community, your civilian population, to an occupied area. This is also what the Nazis wanted to do in Ukraine, right? They wanted Lebensraum im Osten, living space in the East. And this is exactly what Israel also wants, living space in its East. And I mean, they're even renaming places like street names, giving them Hebrew names instead of Arab names. And these settlements, Israel acknowledges them as legal, right? I mean, there are different types. There's also the outposts, which are illegal even by Israeli standards, but I mean, they are not really. If this is again what is said, bullshit. Let's stick to reality. If they were really illegal, according to Israel, then Israel would just abolish them and Israel would just jail these people creating outposts. Clearly, Israel has no problem with the outposts. But the thing is, after a while, an outpost is acknowledged by Israel and then it becomes a legal settlement. At least in the eyes of Israel. Of course, Israel cannot just declare something illegal. That's not how it works, right? It's still illegal under international law. But in the eyes of Israel, these settlements are legal. And I ask you, how can you say Israel has not annexed the territory if Israel says our people living here, colonizing this territory, this is perfectly fine, this is legal, and they are gonna stay here? This is annexation. No other way to call it. And I mean, they want to go on, right? The settlers want to keep settling the West Bank, but they're also very eager to settle Gaza. And I mean, they've already been doing boats tours around Gaza, watching it being bombed, watching their future home, right? And I mean, the whole plan of Israel, the officially stated plan, has been annexing at least parts of Gaza. I mean, this is the original war goal was clearly ethnic cleansing. I mean, they moved into northern Gaza, which did not make sense from the very start. They said they wanted to get back the hostages. They said they wanted to destroy Hamas. Why would you not have moved in from all the sides? Just from a tactical standpoint. I mean, why would Hamas and why would all the hostages be just in the north? Why couldn't they be in the south and Rafah? From the very start, this did not make sense from the perspective of the stated war goals. It made perfect sense if you wanted to do ethnic cleansing, because they went from the north steadily to the south, always telling people to evacuate, to leave the fighting zones, pushing people further south to the Egyptian border, and they hoped to push them past the border. And then they would never have let them in again. Of course, this failed, one, because Egypt wouldn't take the people, and second, because the people refused to leave. Because again, most of them are descendants of Nakba survivors. They know full well what happens if they leave. They know that they will never be permitted to return. But with that, when Israel realized that, and I mean, they really tried to get rid of the people. They basically called every country they could think of, asking them if they would take them in. The next plan, and this is what Israel, again, very clearly stated, the next plan was, okay, maybe we cannot get rid of them completely, we cannot take all of Gaza, but we are gonna concentrate the population that we haven't killed in a big camp in the south. Yes, a concentration camp. And I'm not the first one to say that. Eyal Ben-Venisti has said it. And Eyal Ben-Venisti, if you don't know, is a Jewish Israeli lawyer, and is the lawyer, amongst others, that Israel picked to defend it in front of the international court against South Africa's accusation of genocide. So clearly this is not a good guy. Clearly this is a scumbag. If he is willing to defend a genocidal ethno-state, if he stood behind Israel at that point, we are not talking about a good person here. But even he said what Israel is planning now is a crime against humanity and is the erection of a concentration camp. And this is, I think, something that maybe the media should have reported on. Like, maybe that would have been worth a headline. Israel's own lawyer accuses Israel of genocide. But, yeah, nobody really cared, right? So, but yeah, that's the plan, to annex at least a part of Gaza, to concentrate the population in a smaller area, in a concentration camp, and have the northern part of Gaza be resettled. And that's basically what Israel always does, right? The important point is, this is not limited to the Palestinians. It's not just that Israel doesn't accept the Palestinians' right to self-determination and doesn't consider Palestine a real state whose borders need to be respected. Israel accepts none of its neighbors. I mean, it has always expanded, right? It grabbed the Sinai Peninsula. Of course, it had to eventually give it back because of the pressure, but not really because it wanted to, right? Again, Israel is too small and not powerful enough for full-blown totalitarianism, but you have to ask yourself, what would Israel do if it could? But yeah, the Sinai Peninsula, but also it grabbed the Golan Heights from Syria, right? And I mean, again, it annexed them. In this case, even officially, like it's really saying this is ours now, and this is gonna stay ours. And again, the Western states, the Western allies, they just accept it. And I mean, now when Assad fell, they could have used that, because the pretense was always, oh, we need to occupy the Golan Heights, otherwise they will shoot at us from there. Well, now they could have said, okay, the old regime that used to shoot at us, that we were enemies with, is gone. Let's give it a fresh start. Let's at least try, and as a show of goodwill, we are returning the Golan Heights, showing that we want to commit to peace with the Syrian people, but they didn't do that. In fact, what they did is they started a war of aggression with Syria. And this is one point where, to me, it's grossly obvious how hypocritical the West is, and how the West really doesn't care about international law at all. How Israel just has total impunity, and the West will let it get away with anything, right? Because in the case of Gaza, there was at least a pretense. I mean, sure, it's a genocide, but at least Israel said, no, we are only killing all these civilians because they are being used as human shields. We want to kill Hamas. We want to free the hostages. But in the case of Syria, there's no Hamas there. There are no hostages there. There was not a single rocket fired there. It's just very clearly a war of aggression. And I mean, don't come at me with, oh, Israel is protecting the Druze from massacres. That is exactly, and I mean exactly, what Putin has been saying. That he is protecting Moscovians in Ukraine from massacres, from genocide. So if we don't let Putin get away with that pretense, then how can we let Israel get away with it? No, it's very clear that Israel just has a neighbor that is weakened from over a decade of civil war, and the previous regime just having been toppled. And Israel just used that opportunity, that weakened state of its neighbor, to just attack it, completely unprovoked, and to grab more land. And I mean, immediately, Israeli settlers went behind the army into Syria to stake their claim there. And I mean, if Israel didn't want that, I'm sure they could have prevented that. I mean, how can civilians in the middle of a war just cross the border into freshly conquered enemy territory and walk around there? I mean, clearly, when it's international citizens that are sailing in international waters, that are trying to deliver aid to a starved population in a genocide, then the IGF has absolutely no problem apprehending them and locking them away and torturing them. So you cannot tell me that they could not have apprehended and locked away a few settlers that went into Syrian territory, but clearly they didn't. Just like they didn't pirate the boat of the settlers that went around Gaza to look at the territory they want to settle. No, clearly there are plans, there are people in Israel that want to extend into Syria, just like they already have with the Golan Heights. And just like that, there are, of course, people that want to extend into southern Lebanon. In fact, this is the ideology of the settler movement. if you ask these fundamentalist settlers, they dream of Greater Israel. They will tell you that Israel's borders should be from the Nile in Egypt to the Euphrates River in Iraq, and that every territory in between there is rightfully theirs, and they won't even stop there. I mean, of course, this is not a realistic scenario. They will never manage to even get that far. But if we imagine they really managed to conquer everything from the Nile to the Euphrates, do you really, for a second, believe that these settlers would be content, that they would say, okay, this is it. We got what we wanted. We got what God promised us. Now everything beyond these borders is another state, and we accept it as another state, and we will treat it as a on eye level, as a state just as sovereign as us. No. They would still go on. They would still use every opportunity to grab more land. So, to be sure, it's even less likely for Israel than it was for Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union to conquer the whole world, but at least the tendency, the direction where it goes, is also for world domination, and the settlers say as much. They believe in a world where basically the whole world is ruled by Israel, with Jerusalem as the capital, and everyone coming to the newly built temple and bowing down there, and every Jew having 2,000 non-Jewish slaves, because that is what non-Jews were created for. They don't have a real soul, and they are only happy as Jewish slaves. That is their ideology. That is what I want.
ומה בשלב הבא?
לא רק להקים יישובים ביהודה ושומרון, אלא גם לעבור לעבר ירדן המזרחי ולכבוש אותו ולבנות בו.
אבל בעבר הירדן המזרחי יש מדינה אחרת, יש ירדן.
הכל זמני.
אז מה עם גבולות הארץ לפי תפיסתך?
גבולות התורה.
מה הם?
מנהר פרת עד חידקל, מגיע כמעט עד עיראק.
והנילוס?
כן.
הלאה?
אני לא, אל תתפוס אותי על המילה, אני לא...
גבולות ההבטחה הם המרחב שבין הנילוס והפרת. מה שעם ישראל יוכל לכונן בתוך המרחב הזה, זה מימוש של גבולות ההבטחה. גבולות ההבטחה ניתנו כאופציה, שבתוך המרחב הזה כל מקום אשר תדרוך כף רגליכם בו, לכם יהיה.
ארץ ישראל עתידה להתפשט על כל הארצות, אחת מהנבואות. כל מקום שנכבוש ונחליט שהוא ארץ ישראל, הוא ארץ ישראל.
And to be sure, someone could say, okay, but these are just some fringe guys, you cannot, these are just some extremists, you cannot pretend that this is all of Israel. To that, I want to reply, first off, to be sure, I'm not saying this is the opinion of every single Israeli, or even of the majority of Israelis. But then, I'm also not saying that every, or even a majority of Germans in 1933, when the Nazis were voted into power, really wanted to exterminate all the Jews, or really wanted to conquer living space in Ukraine. You don't need a majority to be that extreme. You just, it's enough if it's 20% or 30%. You just need the extremists to be in power, and you just need the majority to not be radically against it, to be willing to go along with it. Maybe even be dragged along, but at least not to stand against it. That's enough. And the other thing I'm gonna say is that, well, Israel, certainly, not just the settlers, certainly, if you look at it, especially today, but also throughout its whole history, it really has this mentality of not meeting its neighbors on equal footing, on eye level. not seeing the Arab nations as sovereign states, but rather to Israel, it's a jungle. I mean, the former Prime Minister Ehud Barak said, we are the villa in the jungle. So we are here, we are the beacon of civilization. Everything around us is a jungle. And in the jungle, there are no laws. And you can make any territory yours that you want. And if there are people living in the jungle, then they are not nations. They don't have states. The only people that live in the jungle are savage tribes. And that's how they see all the Arabs. I mean, for all the talk about its neighbors wanting to destroy Israel and not accepting Israel's right to exist, it seems to me that the one nation in the Middle East that does not really accept a single of its neighbors as a sovereign state with sovereign borders, the one nation that feels free to push its neighbors around, to attack its neighbors, to annex land from its neighbors, to expand in neighbors' territories, to bomb neighbors, is Israel. And the only thing that holds Israel back in some cases, like currently in Egypt, seems to be if the neighbor is too strong currently to attack him. But if the neighbor is weak, like Lebanon or Syria, there's no holding back. I mean, Israel is attacking those countries and expanding into them. Israel is sending drones to bomb the Sumud flotilla as far away as Tunisia. Israel is bombing Qatar. And again, the West just accepts that, even though Qatar is an ally even of the US. And I don't want anyone to say, oh, but they bombed Hamas people there. Yes, so what? Fuck that. Qatar is a sovereign state. I mean, what would we say if some Moscovian diplomats went to, let's say, Turkey, and were sitting around in Turkey, and Ukraine would just send missiles to bomb them in the middle of Istanbul or somewhere? Doesn't matter that they are enemies. They are in a third sovereign country, and you have to accept the sovereignty of that country. I know that especially for the US, that is probably a hard concept to grab, because it's not like they have accepted the sovereignty of countries like Pakistan, where they just have flown drone attacks for years. But that is how it should be. You cannot just go onto another country's territory and just bomb around there. You can do that only if that territory is no man's land, if it doesn't belong to anyone. And that is the attitude that the totalitarians have towards any territory that they don't control. To them, there's not our state and another state. There's just territory that we already control and territory that we don't control yet. And this has always been implied in Zionism, because Zionism, of course, is about getting the Jews back into their land, Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, right? Which is not identical with the current so-called state of Israel. But the problem is that in Zionism, there's no clear definition what is the land of Israel. And you can see that if you read the Israeli Declaration of Independence from 1948. It says that, yes, the Jews have the right to establish a state in the land of Israel, but it does not define what are the limits of that land, where are its borders. So it leaves that open. And let me be clear to all the early Zionists, doesn't matter if they were on the right or if they were left-wing Zionists, the land of Israel was certainly not limited to Israel's current borders. It was not even limited to current-day Palestine. It certainly included what was then Transjordan, so modern-day Jordan. they wanted to settle that too. It was not just from the river to the sea for them. It was also the other bank of the river. That is also ours. We also have a right to settle there. They said that very clearly. And you might say, oh, okay, but then they accepted the partition plan. Well, they accepted it on paper, but that was just tactics, right? Let's see what Ben-Gurion said about that, who became the first prime minister of Israel, and you cannot be accused of being some right-wing fundamentalist who was a left-winger, a social democrat, a socialist, and an atheist. But even so, he very clearly said, of course the partition of the country gives me no pleasure. But the country that they are partitioning is not in our actual possession. It is in the possession of the Arabs and the English. What is in our actual possession is a small portion, less than what they are proposing for a Jewish state. If I were an Arab, I would have been very indignant. But in this proposed partition, we will get more than what we already have, so of course much less than we merit and desire. The question is, would we obtain more without partition? If things were to remain as they are, would this satisfy our feelings? What we really want is not that the land remain whole and unified. What we want is that the whole and unified land be Jewish. A unified Eretz Israel would be no source of satisfaction for me if it were Arab. From our standpoint, the status quo is deadly poison. We want to change the status quo. But how can this change come about? How can this land become ours? The decisive question is, does the establishment of a Jewish state advance or retard the conversion of this country into a Jewish country? My assumption, which is why I am a fervent proponent of a state, even though it is now linked to partition, is that a Jewish state on only part of the land is not the end, but the beginning. When we acquire 1,000 or 10,000 dunams, we feel elated. It does not hurt our feelings that by this acquisition we are not in possession of the whole land. This is because this increase in possession is of consequence not only in itself, but because through it we increase our strength. And every increase in strength helps in the possession of the land as a whole. The establishment of a state, even if only on a portion of the land, is the maximal reinforcement of our strengths at the present time and a powerful boost to our historical endeavors to liberate the entire country. We shall admit into the state all the Jews we can. We firmly believe that we can admit more than 2 million Jews. We shall build a multifaceted Jewish economy, agricultural, industrial, and maritime. We shall organize an advanced defense force, a superior army which I have no doubt will be one of the best armies in the world. At that point I am confident that we would not fail in settling in the remaining parts of the country, through agreement and understanding with our Arab neighbors, or through some other means. Our ability to penetrate the country will increase if we have a state. Our strengths vis-à-vis the Arabs will likewise increase. The possibilities for construction and multiplication will speedily expand. The greater the Jewish strength in the country, the more the Arabs will realize that it is neither beneficial nor possible for them to withstand us. On the contrary, it will be possible for the Arabs to benefit enormously from the Jews, not only materially, but politically as well. Let us assume that the Negev will not be allotted to the Jewish state. In such event, the Negev will remain barren because the Arabs have neither the competence nor the need to develop it or make it prosper. They already have an abundance of deserts, but not of manpower, financial resources, or creative initiative. It is very probable that they will agree that we undertake the development of the Negev and make it prosper in return for our financial, military, organizational, and scientific assistance. It is also possible that they will not agree. People don't always behave according to logic, common sense, or their own practical advantage. Just as you yourself are sometimes split, conflicted between your mind and your emotions, it is possible that the Arabs will follow the dictates of sterile nationalist emotions and tell us, we want neither your honey nor your sting. We'd rather that the Negev remain barren than that Jews should inhabit it. If this occurs, we will have to talk to them in a different language, and we will have a different language. But such a language will not be ours without a state. This is so because we can no longer tolerate that vast territories capable of absorbing tens of thousands of Jews should remain vacant, and the Jews cannot return to their homeland because the Arabs prefer that the place remains neither ours nor theirs. We must expel Arabs and take their place. Up to now, all our aspirations have been based on an assumption, one that has been vindicated throughout our activities in the country, that there is enough room in the land for the Arabs and ourselves. But if we are compelled to use force, not in order to dispossess the Arabs of the Negev or Transjordan, but in order to guarantee our right to settle there, our force will enable us to do so. A Jewish state must be established immediately, even if it is only in part of the country. The rest will follow in the course of time. A Jewish state will come. Every school child knows that there is no such thing in history as a final arrangement. Not with regard to the regime, not with regard to borders, and not with regard to international agreements. History, like nature, is full of alterations and change. This, of course, also completely refutes the common argument, oh, all of this is just because the Arabs didn't accept the partition in 48, right? The Palestinians could have had a state of their own if they had just accepted the UN partition plan, then everything could have been fine. It's all their fault. I mean, there's of course a lot that is wrong with that argument. Starting with the fact that the Jews at the time made up about 1/3 of the population, and the Palestinians made up 2/3 of the population between the river and the sea. And still the Jews got about 56% of the land by the partition plan, and the Palestinians got about 43%. Why should they have accepted that? And then also, who gave the UN the right to partition the land anyways? I mean, who was the UN at that point? It was not what it is today. It was mainly a club of colonial powers, right? Because many of today's states didn't even exist yet because they were still colonies. It was mainly the colonial powers amongst each other partitioning the world, who gave them permission for that. And then also, why would the Arabs, like, even if they had gotten 2/3 of the country for their 2/3 population, still, why would they have had to accept partition at all? I mean, this is their land, and suddenly some Europeans move in there to colonize it, and I mean, that's what they were for them, right? It doesn't matter whether they were Jews or something else, but they were clearly European, bringing their European customs, even at some points planting European trees to feel more at home instead of the homegrown Mediterranean trees. Why should they just accept this act of colonialism? But all of that aside, when you hear the actual statements by Ben-Gurion, and he was not alone, this was the common opinion of the Zionists at the time, right? I'm quoting him because he was the first prime minister, but there were others saying similar things. What they said is, okay, we are accepting the partition now so that we get a state at all. Better a small state than nothing. But we will not resign ourselves to these borders. The at least long-term plan is to expand to all the land of Israel, whatever that is. But certainly it's all of Palestine, and certainly it's also the other side of the Jordan River. So if you can accuse the Palestinians of anything, then it's just that they were less politically prudent and pragmatic and less savvy. But clearly, the Israelis, in accepting the partition plan, were not being honest. It's just what I said about totalitarianism. The state is just a means to an end. They want to transcend the state. They might take power of a state that already exists, like in Germany or in Moscow, or in this case, they might accept the creation of a new limited state. But just so they can accumulate power at all. Just so they have a base of operation from which to expand. And just to mention one more point, with this not accepting your neighbors as sovereign states, but rather treating this as no man's land, as a wild west where you can just expand and conquer, with this, of course, by necessity, comes also not accepting international law. If totalitarianism is to be total indeed, then of course it can accept no higher laws or no higher powers above it. It cannot be part of a global community. Again, to Arendt, what really matters in politics is human plurality. We are many, and we have to live together somehow as many, and somehow get along as many. And totalitarianism is sort of the antithesis to politics. It destroys politics because it does not accept this plurality. The others need to go. They don't exist, at least not as real human beings that have just as much rights as me. That goes for the individuals, but it also goes for the states. So it is unthinkable that a totalitarian state is part of a global community, is part of international institutions such as the UN, because then, well, it would no longer be totalitarian, right? It would accept that it too has to submit to some laws, and it would accept that other states have just as much right to their sovereignty as they have. So for that reason, for example, Germany under the Nazis left the League of Nations, which was which had been founded after World War I, right, and was kind of the predecessor to the UN that we have now. Germany left that. And you can likewise see that the totalitarian movements nowadays, they also don't accept anything above them. So they are about lawlessness not only within their territory, but in the world at large. They are also about international lawlessness. They want to live in a jungle where they can do anything, if they just manage to be the strongest, right? You can see that Trump has absolutely no regard for international law or international institutions. It's very much America first. And I mean, this has always been American politics, right? Which is also why America doesn't accept the International Criminal Court. But with Trump, it's just even more obvious. And again, it's striking that this goes even for the relation with his own allies, right? Like, he's not really such a fan of NATO, even though it's a great asset for America, and it's just from a strategical standpoint incredibly dumb if you were to get out of NATO, right? But with Israel, you can see that especially. To be sure, Israel has not officially left the UN, just like Nazi Germany left the League of Nations. That's probably because it still has America having its back in the UN. Maybe if America in the Security Council were to drop Israel, maybe then they would actually leave the UN. But for all intents and purposes, Israel has very clearly shown that it accepts nothing above Israel, that it is not willing to submit to any higher laws that are above the state. It's not part of the Rome Statute. It doesn't accept the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. And it's even trying its best to undermine that court, right? I mean, it is known that Israel intelligence service that they spied on the Kurd, that they tried to blackmail or threaten people from the Kurd, like that the former chief persecutor was threatened in person, that they threatened to do something to her family if she were to persecute Israel, which is not how a state behaves, but rather how the mafia behaves, right? And likewise, Israel has zero regard for the UN. They don't let in the special rapporteur, right? The UN has this system of special rapporteurs on human rights issues. They are experts in their field, and then they are to report twice a year on certain human rights situations. They might be rapporteurs for a specific topic, like the right to water, or like medical rights or whatever, free speech. But they also can be assigned a specific country. And so there's a special rapporteur for the occupied territories, which of course is currently the wonderful Francesca Albanese, but even before her, her predecessors were also not allowed, just like she's not allowed to go to the West Bank and do their job, investigate the human rights situation there. And to that I can only say, why? If Israel has nothing to hide, if there are no human rights violations there, why not let her in? And what is striking is that even the Taliban let in the special rapporteur for Afghanistan to investigate the human rights situation there. So the Taliban have more regard for the international law than Israel has. And likewise, Israel has declared the UN Secretary General a persona non grata. He's not allowed to enter Israel. And if nothing else, then that should have been the moment when Israel should have been kicked out of the UN, because it basically kicked itself out. It basically declared itself independent of the UN for all intents and purposes. I mean, imagine if a state, like a US state, told the president, you are not welcome here, no, you're not allowed to enter that state. That would be considered an act of rebellion, right? That would start a civil war, probably. So, Israel is very clearly a woke state. If by a woke state we understand what it should mean, a state literally going woke, not accepting international law, not accepting international organizations, not willing to submit to any higher law, but rather doing what it wants, going amok, behaving like in a lawless jungle. This is what Israel does, and this is typical totalitarian behavior.
Can you put the gun down?
Sucker the motor. Where are you from?
From London.
You've been in the market?
Yes.
You also?
Yes.
She work with you?
She's
Yes.
American.
Yes. Can you show me ID?
Me?
Everyone.
Yeah, sure.
It's very slow going. We've been there in that queue for an hour or more.
Yes. What? How much time you gonna stay in Israel?
Hang on, but I don't think we're in Israel.
Huh?
Are we in Israel?
You're in Israel now?
Are we?
Yes.
In the
No.
West Bank? No?
There's one more thing I want to address, and that is the origin of this totalitarianism. As Arendt says, totalitarianism has its roots in the imperialism of the end of the 19th century, of mainly the last 2 decades of the 19th century. And you can find these elements that I described. You can find this endless accumulation of power. You can find this movement, because imperialism too was always moving forwards, right? Always conquering more territory. And you can find this boundlessness, limitlessness, both inwardly and outwardly in imperialism, right? Like inwardly, this imperialism, like happened in Africa, this is not conquering a territory and incorporating it into your state, like maybe in ancient or medieval times, like maybe the Roman Empire did. The people you conquer, they are not becoming your citizens. They are savages in your eyes, and they remain savages. They are now just savages under your control. And what do you do with them? Well, exterminate all the brutes, as it is said in the novel Heart of Darkness, which very much inspired and informed Arendt in her writing. And if you look at the atrocities committed against the natives, which precisely because they were not citizens, because they were considered savages, because this was considered no man's land that you would just conquer and then rule, not by law, but by decree, by arbitrary rule, you could do anything with them. I mean, look at the atrocities, for example, in the Congo, where the Belgish king, Leopold II, killed about 10 million people, right? He does not really have to hide from the likes of Hitler and Stalin. I mean, we are used to treat imperialism as more of a footnote in history, overshadowed by the much, much more terrible atrocities that happened in Europe some decades later. Of course, we here in the European countries, we know that we had colonies, and we say, yes, it was not such a good thing. But all in all, we don't care and we don't know anything about it. But I mean, from the perspective of the people who suffered from it, probably didn't feel so different from the totalitarianism. Maybe the fact that we view it so differently is again down to racism, right? Because one time it happened far away to black people, and one time it happened here to our own. So of course this feels more terrible or more important. But again, Leopold II also killed 10 million people. It's not so different from what Hitler or Stalin did. And you can very clearly see that everything was possible there, every imaginable atrocity. Like, for example, they would, because they thought that the soldiers were wasting too much munition, they counted the munition, and they would say for every shot you have to actually kill someone, and to prove it, you have to bring a hand. So they would hack off the hands of countless people, not just dead people, but also people alive, and collect these dried up hands in baskets. Terrible things happened there in the Congo. And of course, what you also have in imperialism is this constant expansion, this never-ending extension of the borders, right? Precisely because this is considered no man's land. This is, I already mentioned, the Wild West, right? America always expanding more westwards, precisely because these people living there are not considered real nations with real sovereign states and borders, but rather this is just empty land that we haven't conquered yet. It never stops. The imperialism can always go on. The only limit is the globe itself. And even that is not a limit that the imperialist likes to accept. Arendt remarks that Cecil Rhodes, the businessman who basically led the imperialism in South Africa, and that he was annoyed by the view of the stars at night because it reminded him how many worlds there are out there that he can never conquer, right? And colonize. And you could say that maybe someone like Elon Musk is the modern day Cecil Rhodes, coincidentally also from South Africa, and that thanks to the advancement in technology, the stars don't annoy him anymore, because he now very much does plan to also conquer and colonize them, right? To get to Mars. And I'm pretty sure if technology had allowed it, Cecil Rhodes would have planned similar things. So there's no limit to the expansion in imperialism. You could say, if you wanted to be a bit simplistic and polemical, totalitarianism is just what if imperialism happened to white people? Or to be a bit more precise, you could say that totalitarianism is auto-imperialism. imperializing yourself, your own country, which is basically what Hitler and Stalin said, right? They learned from the European imperialism. In some cases, maybe directly. I mean, the German Wehrmacht and its generals. I mean, it was a new generation, but they learned from the generals that had committed atrocities in the German colonies before the First World War. But anyways, Stalin, for example, he had the problem that the Soviet Union was such a backwards country, right? That Tsarist Moscow had not really industrialized. And so he said, we first need to industrialize. Others, like the United Kingdom, did that by exploiting their colonies. But basically, every part of the earth already belongs to someone, and we don't have a good connection to the seas anyways, so colonies elsewhere in Africa are not an option for us. So what is left to us, we have to colonize ourselves. He said that. And that's what he did in Ukraine, right? The Holodomor, the starvation there, it's not so untypical if you look at what happened in many places in European colonies. And likewise Hitler in Mein Kampf, and in his second book. He in many ways admired the United States. He said, if you want to be a great power, you need colonies. But the error of the German Empire was to try to get colonies in Africa. That doesn't work, as we saw in the First World War, because the seas are controlled by Great Britain and they can just cut us off from Africa. So what is left to us is colonizing the continent, colonizing Eastern Europe. Just like Stalin, he wanted to colonize mainly Ukraine. And as I said, he wanted to model it after America, just like the certain American states expanded westwards, he wanted to expand eastwards. Just like they drove the natives beyond the Mississippi, he wanted to drive the people beyond the Volga. And this self-imperialism, treating your immediate neighbors and in the end treating your own country as if it was an imperial territory, and as if the people there were not citizens but savages or wild animals with whom you can do whatever you want. This can happen. This is something we see in our world here, for example, in the United States, right? What with Trump threatening, sending soldiers into his own cities, right? Threatening Chicago with war openly. It is as if the central government in Washington is treating the American states, the American cities, like Europeans used to treat Africa. Of course not, it's not going as far yet, but this is the direction, right? This is where it seems to be going. As if the American government wanted to conquer and to colonize, to treat as an imperial territory, America itself. And it's interesting what Arendt says about the connection between imperialism and totalitarianism, because she says there's always the danger of it swapping over, so to say. The politics of the imperial territories, or rather the lack of politics there, the end of all politics, of all living together in the plurality of man, can swap back to the motherland. But if there's an ocean in between, there is some separation. Still, the statesmen, they felt uneasy about it often enough. Arendt notes how parliamentarians in the British Parliament, or how the Reichs Chancellor Bismarck, the unifier of Germany, they were not such fans necessarily of colonialism. They felt that it would destroy, that it would explode the national state within its national borders and with its national laws. It were others that wanted imperialism. It was the mob, Arendt says, and it was the capitalists, not necessarily the statesmen. Which, of course, we can also see in Israel, where this is very much pushed by the mob. Again, by the fundamentalist settlers, and certain statesmen, especially amongst the more liberal, more left Zionists, are a bit uneasy about it, but still, as they always do, as they did in the time of imperialism, still coming along, still yielding. But the thing is, Arendt says, it gets dangerous when there is no clear separation between the motherland and the imperial territory, when there's no ocean in between. And that is, if you think about it, exactly the case for Germany and for Muscovy. Both did not have overseas colonies so much. I mean, Germany also had a few of those. Rather, both tried colonizing in front of their own doorstep. And here it is very easy, very likely, almost inevitable, that the lawlessness that is established in the colonies, that people get used to in the colonies, sort of grows back into the motherland. The lawlessness is like a cancer that grows and grows and does not stop, infesting and destroying its host body, and even if it destroys itself in the process, it doesn't care. But if this was the case back in the day for Germany and for Muscovy, it is even more so the case for Israel, right? Never have the imperial territories been closer to the heart of the motherland, never has there been less separation than in Israel. The West Bank is just like another state within America. Like, you can just pass the state borders and you barely notice. You can just commute from Tel Aviv to the West Bank and back. And this cannot be sustained without the lawlessness in the one territory seeping back in the other. And here I remind you of the judiciary reform that the current government planned before the 7th of October. They wanted to, through reform, basically take away the power of the Supreme Court, right? They basically wanted to end the separation of powers and any resemblance of rule of law that Israel proper still had. And there were, of course, great protests against that. And we often get reminded of those protests, like the apologists of Israel. They might say, yes, there's a problem with extremists, with far-right people, but other Western democracies also have these problems. We cannot look down on Israel for that. And at least they have a very much alive civil society. They had these protesters fighting for democracy. Fighting for democracy for themselves, not for the Palestinians, right? This protest movement protested against the rule of law being abolished in Israel. They did not protest against there being no rule of law in the West Bank in the first place. And some people wanted to bring that up, and the leaders of the protest movement, of course, they were the more liberal Zionists. Maybe they were hand-wringing a little, saying, yes, sure, this cannot be sustained forever. Eventually, we should do something about the Palestinians too, but let's not focus on that now. It's just gonna drive people away. We need broad support. We need the center. We need even center-right people. So better not to address the Palestinians now. Let's focus on this judiciary reform here. And of course, Israeli Palestinian citizens who wanted to join the protest did not necessarily feel welcome at these protests where everyone was holding Israeli flags and singing the Israeli national anthem, and where they basically were not allowed to talk about their Palestinian issues and about the West Bank, or let alone Gaza. And just as an aside, these people who protested this reform are largely the same people who in the past 2 years have protested for Netanyahu to end the bombing and to go into negotiations. Here in the West, we have often been told, oh, see, not everyone in Israel is for war, genocide, or whatever. Sure, not everyone. But it's really just a small minority that is against the genocide. These larger protests have not been anti-genocide protests. These people don't care about the Palestinians, they just care about their own hostages. They are saying, Netanyahu, don't sacrifice the hostages, agree to a ceasefire, agree to negotiations to get the hostages back. But many of them don't necessarily care if afterwards Gazans keep being bombed and stuffed. But anyways, these protesters, what they don't see is it's not a coincidence that this judiciary reform is pushed by a government, by the first government which is ruled by the settler movement. So by people from this lawless totalitarian West Bank. I mean, ministers are living in the West Bank, right? I don't know if there's a single other state on this planet that has ministers in the government that don't live in the state which they are supposed to rule. But you have people, of course, two most famous people. One is Bezalel Smotrich, who is actually the de facto governor of the West Bank, right? Another proof that Israel annexed it, because it's not as it used to be governed by military people, by generals, as you would expect in an occupation, but rather it is now governed by a civil governor, that is by Smotrich, who is the Minister of Finance, and who also says of himself, I am a homophobic, racist fascist. Yeah, and of course, who often said that he wanted to starve Gaza completely, not a single grain should go in there, and who assured his voters that even when they did send a little food again, it was just to appease the Western allies. It was just because of pressure, but they would make sure to send too little food. This is the kind of guy that Western media wants to tell us is not capable of a genocide, right? And then, of course, probably an even more nasty fellow, we have Itamar Ben-Gvir, the Minister of Security, who as such is head of the prisons, which of course were terrible even before, but especially under him, I mean, you simply have to say it, Guantanamo is probably at this point wellness compared to an Israeli prison. I mean, we have all heard what they did to the international activists, and still those are at least somewhat protected by the fact that they are citizens of real countries. You can imagine how much worse it is for the Palestinian hostages, and that, as the Israeli journalist Gideon Levy has pointed out, is what they are, right? People in the Israeli prisons, they have been handcuffed so tightly that it stopped blood circulation, and that they had to get amputated by often underqualified medical personnel. People there, they get raped by soldiers, by dogs even. Get raped with metal rods, with rifles, with a fire extinguisher, with a phone put into their rectum. People have been raped to death. there are the most terrible crimes against humanity happening in those prisons under Ben Gvir. And likewise, Ben Gvir is, of course, as security minister, the head of the police, which is turning into his own thugs, and he's handing out guns to the settlers to organize as a mob to commit to their pogroms. And this Ben Gvir, I mean, Israel himself convicted him as a terrorist when he was younger. Now, don't ask me why convicted terrorists can still become a minister. I mean, I guess the answer is because Israel is not a state of law, and it's not a rule of law state, and it's not a democracy. And this Ben Gvir also is a terrorist supporter. He for years had a picture in his living room of Baruch Goldstein, who is a terrorist that, opening fire in a mosque, killed 29 Palestinians. And it is these people bringing lawlessness to Israel proper, to its prisons, to its police force. These people that live within the lawlessness in the West Bank, that have been pushing this judiciary reform. Which is also why several thousand Israeli Jewish intellectuals signed an open letter titled "The Elephant in the Room" before October the 7th, where they addressed the protest movement and where they clearly told them that they cannot protest the rule of law being abolished in Israel while not protesting there not being a rule of law but rather apartheid in the West Bank. This just doesn't make sense. We, academics and other public figures from Israel, Palestine and abroad, call attention to the direct link between Israel's recent attack on the judiciary and its illegal occupation of millions of Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories. Palestinian people lack almost all basic rights, including the right to vote and protest. They face constant violence. This year alone, Israeli forces have killed over 190 Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza and demolished over 590 structures. Settler vigilantes burn, loot, and kill with impunity. Without equal rights for all, whether in one state, two states, or in some other political framework, there is always a danger of dictatorship. There cannot be democracy for Jews in Israel as long as Palestinians live under a regime of apartheid, as Israeli legal experts have described it. Indeed, the ultimate purpose of the judicial overhaul is to tighten restrictions on Gaza, deprive Palestinians of equal rights both beyond the Green Line and within it, annex more land, and ethnically cleanse all territories under Israeli rule of their Palestinian population. The problems did not start with the current radical government. Jewish supremacism has been growing for years and was enshrined in law by the 2018 nation-state law. And one of the authors of that letter has been Omar Bartov, a world-renowned genocide scholar, an expert on the Holocaust, Israeli historian. And I don't think that's a coincidence. And surely, being an expert on the Holocaust, on the Nazi crimes, on the crimes of the Wehrmacht, the German army, surely he has read Hannah Arendt. I can't imagine that he hasn't. So he's probably aware of these things. What we see happening in Israel is this typical osmosis, you could say, of the totalitarianism, of the lawlessness that rules in colonies, that seeps into the motherland if the motherland is not properly disconnected from the colonies. And it has to happen this way. There is no real way how this could not happen. There's no real way to stop this unless, of course, you go the other way. Unless, of course, you establish laws in the colonies or let the colonies be free. So that is what we see in Israel. That is what Arendt describes. So a totalitarian form of rule comes about in imperialism. And if there is no clear distinction between the imperial colonies and the motherland, it can seep back. And then it is when you get as I said at the start, there's also some other conditions, like you would need an especially big country, but this is how totalitarianism, or in this case at least clear totalitarian elements, come into being and come into power. And there is no way to stop it except through the law, except through statehood. Which brings me to the end. I think, and I hope I could show that this is what Arendt found is very important and very helpful to understand many things going on right now, not just in Israel, but on the wider world, like in the US. And I hope it shows you that those people who claim that the state is the problem, right? Like Reagan said, the most scary sentence someone could say is, I'm from the government and I'm here to help, and that you are more free if the state is abolished. Those people are not your friends. And it's no coincidence that it's those libertarians like Musk or Thiel are always on the side of the right-wingers, are always on the side of the fascists. Because you could say that totalitarianism is kind of fascism minus the state, right? Fascism as such is bad enough, like you had in Italy or in Spain, but if it is combined with statelessness and with movement, then you get totalitarianism. And now, what is happening now is that this totalitarian lawlessness is spreading. I mean, you can see how Israel, because it has total impunity, because its allies allow it anything, more and more applies this not just to the Palestinians, but to anyone who is on their side, right? I mean, for years, again and again, they have murdered activists that were citizens of even their allies, like the US, right? And just some days ago, we saw them completely disregarding international law again, completely acting as a woke state again, engaging in piracy, abducting people in international waters, and then torturing them. People that were not Palestinian, that were not stateless, but that actually have citizenship of states, right? Imagine if someone else had done that. Like, when the Houthis attack ships, if they were to attack ships in international waters and take citizens of European or nations or of the US as hostages and torture them, that would be called terrorism at the least. Or if Putin, not in his own waters, but more out in the Baltic, in international waters, were to abduct peaceful activists trying to bring aid to Ukraine, were to torture them, there would be an outrage. There isn't when Israel does it. But it's not just Israel. The lawlessness is spreading. I already mentioned, we see it in the US, right? We see people that protested Israel also being abducted in broad daylight, being deported. And here in Germany, for example, already some years ago, before the 7th of October, we had this BDS resolution, which all the politicians, all the media now supported. They often fail to mention who started it, who pushed for it. It was the AfD, the Nazi party. They were like, oh, all these Arab immigrants, they're all anti-Semites, we need to do something about it, it's a disgrace that we don't do something about it. And then the other parties felt pushed, and instead of pushing back, they actually complied, and they basically all agreed. There was no real opposition on this BDS resolution that is about, well, condemning BDS as anti-Semitic, which of course it isn't. I mean, there are Jews in taking part in it, and also BDS is perfectly so first off, BDS is modeled after the boycott of South Africa, right? And apartheid in South Africa would not have fallen without that. It is very clear, everyone who knows Israel, like people that lived in the Israeli society, Israeli historians like Omar Bartov, Avi Schleim, Ilan Pape, Gideon Levy, they clearly say change is not gonna come from within. There are very, very few, all the more courageous, all the more applaudable Israelis who are against apartheid and against genocide, but the society as large is simply racist and Jewish supremacist, and there simply is this very strong totalitarian tendency. If it's gonna change, it's gonna change through pressure from the outside. So BDS is needed. And also it's perfectly in line with international law, right? Because in fact, I would go so far as to say we have a duty. We are bound by law to join in BDS, to boycott Israel, because the International Court has ruled that the occupation is illegal. And Israel was given until this September, so the time has passed already, to completely end the occupation and to completely dismantle all the settlements and to pull all of its people out. It didn't do that. And all other countries now have the duty not to support the occupation. But the thing is, if you support Israel at all, you are supporting the occupation. It's silly. I mean, many countries like Germany will condemn the occupation, will condemn the settlements, but then be firmly on the side of Israel. That is silly. You cannot do that. If you don't want to support the occupation, well, then you can't support the occupier. It makes no sense, right? If you really don't want to support the occupation, then you can't support the occupier. It just makes no sense, right? Like if someone is a baker and then he breaks into his neighbor's house and locks his neighbor into the basement and then makes a second bakery out of his neighbor's house where the neighbor family is locked in the basement, you cannot say, oh, I don't support that and therefore I will not buy bread from that second bakery in the illegally occupied house, but I will still buy his bread that he makes in his own bakery. No, you then don't buy his bread. Or even better, you call the police to kick him out and lock him away, which is what the Colombian president has suggested, right? But anyways, so since it is very clear that every country has a duty not to support the occupation, I would say every country has a duty to cut all ties with Israel, because that is how you don't support the occupation. So clearly there's nothing wrong with BDS, but this resolution said BDS is anti-Semitic. We don't want to support it. And people in Germany should not support it, like artists and such. And German state institutions should not support people that support BDS. So if an artist supports boycotting Israel, then he should not get funded by state institutions like museums, theaters, whatever. He should not get prizes that are funded by the state and so on. And of course, many artists, they depend on that, right? They're independent people, they have no steady job, steady income, they depend on these prizes and such. And the thing is that this resolution is totalitarian. Because again, totalitarianism is this arbitrary rule by bureaucracy, by decree, and that's what this is. It's not a law. It's not a law. No one has to follow it. It's just a resolution. And for a good reason, because the parliament, they asked their own lawyers, and their own lawyers said, well, if you pass this as a law, it will go to the Supreme Court, to the Constitutional Court, and they will topple that law because it would be unconstitutional as a law. It would be against freedom of opinion, freedom of speech. So it's just a resolution. No one has to follow it, but they do. And so many people, like many artists, will of course self-censor, and many institutions, like again museums, theaters, galleries and such, will of course kick out such artists or not invite such artists, even though they don't have to, they are not bound by law, but in order to not get into trouble, in order to not have their funds shortened. And this is exactly how totalitarian rule works. And you can also see, for example, last year there was a Palestine conquest that was to be held here in Germany. and the police closed it, which later a court ruled was against the law, but by that time they had already done it, right? They said, oh, anti-Semitic things could be said here, and so they shut it down, and they even gave some of the foreigners that were to speak there prohibitions of politically engaging in Germany, which meant not only could they not come to Germany to do something here, like hold a speech, not even via video were they allowed to speak here. Like since the conference had one of them speak via video, that was already enough to shut the conference down. And these people that were barred from political engagement in Germany, they were not anti-Semites, they were not far-right extremists or terrorists. They were people like Varoufakis, who used to be the finance minister of Greece. I mean, whatever you think of him, he used to be a minister of one of our other EU countries. Or there were people like Abu Sita, who is the rector, who's the head of the university in Glasgow. Again, not some fringe extremist, but the head of a European university. And he was barred not just from Germany, but from the whole Schengen space, which is the common European space where you can move between the countries without having to be checked really at the borders. So, and the UK is not in it anymore because of Brexit, right? So they could do that. So he actually, as a medical aid worker, was in Gaza for a time, and a French parliamentarian invited him to give testimony in France to the parliament. And then the French police said, no, we cannot let him in because Germany barred him from entering the Schengen realm, from entering the EU for a whole year. We can just do that. Not just barring people from our own country, but from other countries without these countries even having a say in it. This is totalitarian. And this is what is spreading, this sort of totalitarianism. So the question we all need to ask ourselves is, what kind of world do we want to live in the future? Do we want to live in a lawless jungle where the strongest rule, where whoever can amass a movement, some sort of ideological movement that makes him rise to power, can do anything? Or do we want to live in a world of laws? Do we want to live under the rule of law, both within one state and globally, internationally, under the rule of international law? Do we want both individuals and people, states, to be held accountable by laws and also to be protected by laws? That is the choice we must make nowadays. That is beyond the fate of just the Palestinians, which of course is also very important, just like the fate of any human being is important, but even beyond that, that is what this is about. And it's quite important in the face of the looming climate crisis that we fix this now. Because when resources get scarce, when droughts hit us, when there might be millions upon millions of refugees, much, much worse things could happen. Much worse wars and genocides. And then we might actually wish that we had fought for international law, for a non-lawless world. And I would say to anyone who says that he doesn't care about the Palestinians, or also about those here protesting in the West for their rights, who also get hit by this sort of ever-growing totalitarianism, or others, right? It also hits others, like climate activists. I would say to such a person, remember Niemöller. Remember what Niemöller said after the days of the Nazis. Because you too might one day look back and have to say, when they came for the Palestinians, I did not care because I was not Palestinian. When they came for those who protested for Palestine, I didn't care because I didn't protest for Palestine. And when they came for the climate activists, I did not care because I was not a climate activist. And when they came for me, then there was no one left to care. And one last remark. Especially here in Germany, we have always been told, it has been drilled in our heads, that we must stand by the side of Israel no matter what. Because we have a historical responsibility towards the Jews. Now, of course, it's quite anti-Semitic to identify Israel with the Jews. Israel is not a Jewish state. It can claim to be, but it is not a Jewish state. There are, of course, many noble Jews that are criticizing Israel and fighting against Israel. But even if it was, I disagree that we have a historic responsibility towards the Jews. Yes, the Jews were our victims, to be sure. But they were not the only ones. It's quite interesting how Germans found an easy way out by focusing just on the Jews. You don't hear anyone talking about our historic responsibility towards the Roma. But of course, Nazis were also racist against gypsies and also committed a genocide of gypsies. And still, no one is saying that to be safe and secure in the future, they need their own state, so they have a right to go back to India, to the land where they came from, and conquer it and create an imperialist state there, and then it is our responsibility to stand on the side of that state. No one is saying that. No, quite the contrary, there's still lots and lots of racism against the Roma. And also the Nazis, of course, killed gay people, killed disabled people, and they committed genocide or wanted to commit genocide of Slavic people, of the Ukrainians. You don't hear anyone saying that Germany is responsible for that. Or for its other non-Nazi crimes, for that matter, right? Like, Germany also committed the first genocide of the last century, the genocide against the Herero and Nama people in what is nowadays Namibia. The German government refuses to even acknowledge that. Like, they say, yes, this would have been like genocide, but back then there was no international law forbidding genocide yet, so we will not call it a genocide and not pay reparations for that. That's their official stance. That's really, yes, that's what they said. You cannot make it up. Recently, when I said that to a genocide denier, he answered, "Oh, this is ridiculous. You coming up with all these other groups. The Nazis also persecuted social democrats. Now should Germany have a special responsibility to protect social democrats as well?" And he thought that this was some sort of gotcha. But I think it's a gotcha towards him. It's actually a very good point he's making, that yes, this, if you think it through, if you were not a hypocrite, but try to be consistent, to support all the victims of the Nazis, then yes, just like it's not allowed in Germany to criticize Israel, we should also not be allowed to criticize the Social Democratic Party. This is where this line of thought would lead. So I propose something else. I say our historic responsibility, and of course this goes for Germany, but I would say that this should be the responsibility of everyone, even of the non-Germans. Our responsibility should not be towards specific groups, but should be towards the rule of law. Our historic responsibility should be not to be Zionists, but to be etatists and justists. And we should stand not behind Israel, but behind international law, behind the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, which you can say is the descendant and the heir of the Nuremberg war criminal trials. That is what, especially Germany, but everyone should support. And if we did support that, if there was rule of law, then every group would be safe automatically. The Jews, but also the Roma, also the gay people, also the Ukrainians, also the disabled people, and yes, also the Social Democrats. And of course, last but not least, also the Palestinians. My deep thanks be to my supporters. Leo Allmann, Thomas Deuringer, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Ökobong, Samet Özkilic, Yasin Özün, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, Ron Suhl, as well as to all others who support me and my aufklären cause.